In the early spring of 1892, an older woman in a tiny Rhode Island town shuffled into her kitchen at 1 a.m. to make a late-night cup of tea. And as she passed by her front window, she saw a man riding on horseback down the dirt road outside holding up a flickering lantern. She recognized this man. He was the only doctor in town, and she could tell he was headed towards a large farm at the end of the road. And the woman had heard rumors that the farmer's son was deathly ill. She knew a house call in the middle of the night was not a good sign, but she also knew the doctor could not save the farmer's son. However, she could. So she threw on her coat, lit her own lantern, and set off into the night. From Ballen Studios in Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. And for this week's special Halloween episode, we're exploring something even more terrifying, the supernatural. For centuries, people believed that monsters, demons, and other horrors could cause deadly diseases and all kinds of misery. Nowadays, we tend to reject those explanations as ignorance and superstition, but for one New England farming family in the 1800s, that distinction wasn't so clear. Were they being plagued by a mysterious disease, or were they actually being preyed on by a creature thought only to exist in legend? So, if you like today's story, tell the follow button that you want to play the Floor is Lava game with them, but be sure to hide thumbtacks all over the room before you start playing. This episode is called She Haunts Me. On a spring morning in 1889, a 29-year-old doctor named Harold Metcalf was sitting in his parlor in the tiny town of Exeter, Rhode Island, when he heard his telegraph machine start clicking. He got up, walked over to the large metal machine, and watched it slowly print text onto a long, thin piece of paper. When it finished printing, Dr. Metcalf tore off the paper and read the telegram. It was a message from one of his neighbors, a farmer named George Brown. George said in this telegram that his only son, 22-year-old Edwin, had fallen ill, and he desperately needed Dr. Metcalf's help. The doctor let out a long sigh. He knew the Browns well. They'd once been a happy family of 9, with George, his wife, their 6 daughters, and their son, but Dr. Metcalf was all too aware of the tragedy that had struck the family over the past few years. 7 years ago, George's wife had come down with a mysterious disease that some locals called the White Death. It caused horrible symptoms like chronic fevers, extreme weight loss, and uncontrollable coughing. People with the disease grew pale and weak, and they got so emaciated that they looked like skeletons. It was like the disease literally drained the life out of them. Now, there were a lot of supposed treatments for the White Death, things like riding on horseback every day or drinking brown sugar mixed with water, but Dr. Metcalf knew these remedies did not work. In fact, he knew there was just no proven way to cure the White Death. Now, Dr. Metcalf had tried to help George's wife 7 years earlier by prescribing healthy food and exercise, but she still just kept on getting sicker. And in fact, she would die a year later, and then almost immediately afterwards, one of George's daughters also began showing symptoms of the dreaded disease. And again, Dr. Metcalf tried to help, but there was nothing he could do, and she also died within just a few months. Even though Dr. Metcalf knew the White Death was basically incurable, he still felt guilty for not being able to help George and his loved ones. And now, after reading George's telegram, Dr. Metcalf feared that Edwin might be the latest member of the Brown family to contract the deadly disease. But there was only one way to find out. Dr. Metcalf quickly packed his medical bag, threw a saddle on his horse, and raced off towards the Browns' farm. 15 minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trotted his horse along a thin country road in Exeter. To his right, he saw a vast field overgrown with weeds, with a crumbling country house right in the center. It was once a prosperous farm, but was now abandoned. The sight made Dr. Metcalf sad. He'd lived in Exeter his whole life, and he'd watched the quaint farming community turn into sort of a ghost town. The Civil War and the White Death had decimated the community, leaving only a third of the population alive. In fact, these days, the town was more commonly known by its nickname, Deserted Exeter. After riding for a few more minutes, Dr. Metcalf reached a modest house on 40 acres of farmland. He knocked on the door, and right away, George Brown answered. He looked haggard, and he quickly led Dr. Metcalf to Edwin's bedroom. Inside the room, the doctor saw Edwin's wife and 5 remaining sisters crowded around a big 4-poster bed. Edwin was lying on the mattress in plain sight, but Dr. Metcalf barely could recognize him. The once husky farmhand had become bony and pale. His cheeks were sunken, his eyes were glassy, and when he tried to speak, he fell into a violent coughing fit. It was obvious to everyone, including the doctor, that Edwin had been gripped by the White Death. As Edwin tried to catch his breath, his father, George, approached the side of the bed and looked at the doctor and asked if there was anything he could do. Dr. Metcalf began rattling off his regular treatment plan, healthy food and exercise, but George stopped him. He said they'd already tried those things with his wife and his daughter, and they hadn't worked. There had to be something different they could try. Dr. Metcalf hesitated, but then he said, yeah, there was another option. But he told them it was an experimental treatment, and so he couldn't guarantee it would work. George said he didn't care. At this point, he was willing to try anything to help Edwin. So Dr. Metcalf explained that some physicians believed that the White Death was caused, or at least was made worse, by living in humid climates, like Rhode Island. So it might help if Edwin moved out of Rhode Island and went somewhere with completely different weather. The doctor suggested Colorado Springs, Colorado, because it was a mountain town with very dry air and high elevations, and so it would be a drastic change from Rhode Island. But there was one really obvious problem. To get to Colorado, Edwin would have to travel 2,000 miles, and this would mean days and days of riding trains and horses, all while Edwin was severely ill, like it wasn't clear if he would live through the journey. Plus, his whole family couldn't just go with him, it would basically be Edwin and maybe his wife. And so after explaining this experimental protocol, Dr. Metcalf went quiet and just watched the Browns as they considered what he had just said. And it was obvious the entire family was very upset and didn't know what to make of this, but at the same time, they knew they had no other choice. And so as the sisters kind of held back tears and whispered amongst each other, and as George looked up at the doctor not sure what to say, finally Edwin, from the bed, croaked out the first words he'd said that day. He said that yes, he and his wife would go to Colorado. 3 years later, in January of 1892, Edwin held his wife's hand as they walked through the snow in the Rocky Mountains. The high elevation and dry air in Colorado Springs had worked like a charm. Edwin was back to feeling like his normal self again. After walking a bit longer, Edwin told his wife they should head back home for lunch. When they got to their house, Edwin's wife rushed inside out of the cold, but Edwin stayed for a second and checked the mailbox for any letters from his dad and sisters. And he found there was an envelope, so he opened it and he unfolded the note inside. It was a handwritten letter from his father, and as Edwin scanned the paper, his face fell. The note said that one of Edwin's little sisters, 19-year-old Mercy, had unfortunately passed away. Edwin knew that Mercy had been sick. She'd contracted the White Death almost a year earlier. He had tried to convince her to move out to Colorado with him and his wife because he knew that would cure this, but Mercy said she didn't think she could make the long journey, and she didn't want to leave behind her sisters, and so she had stayed. But now, Mercy was gone, and so Edwin knew he would need to head back to Rhode Island and be there to grieve with his family. A few weeks later, back in Rhode Island, Edwin and his father braced themselves against the harsh winter cold in Exeter, and together, they silently dug rocks out of the frozen ground. They were trying to prepare the field for planting in the spring. It was hard work, but the physical labor was actually a welcome distraction from their grief. Edwin pushed a sharp shovel into the ground, and as he wedged another rock out of the soil, he suddenly felt like a heavy weight was pressing down on his chest. He dropped his shovel and started coughing so hard that it stung his throat. He put a hand over his mouth to block the cough, and when he caught his breath and moved his hand away, he saw that his palm was now speckled with blood. When he looked up, Edwin saw his father staring at him with a horrified expression. They both knew what this meant. Now that he was back in Rhode Island, Edwin's case of the White Death had returned. In March, about a month later, George woke in the night to the sound of his only son coughing violently. George jumped out of bed and rushed to the kitchen to grab a cup of water, and then made his way into Edwin's room, which was dimly lit by an oil lamp. Edwin had become so sick after contracting the White Death that he couldn't go anywhere, and he had been bedridden for the last 2 weeks here in Rhode Island. It was like all the progress he'd made living in Colorado had now been undone, and he was now sicker than he'd been before. He looked frail and gray, and George could see spots on the white bedsheet from where Edwin had been coughing up blood. George held out the cup of water for his son, and Edwin grabbed the glass with shaky hands and drank it in between coughs. Then Edwin looked at his father, and in a hoarse and frightened voice, he said something that terrified George. He said, "She was here. She haunts me." George just stared at his son. He had no idea what his son was talking about, but before George could ask, Edwin was gripped by another coughing fit, and the only thing George could think to do was send for Dr. Metcalf. Less than an hour later, George stood by Edwin's bedside as Dr. Metcalf examined his son. Now, George knew his son was in very bad shape at this point, but he was still shocked when Dr. Metcalf, after examining Edwin, turned to George and just said, "It's in God's hands now." There was apparently nothing he or anyone else could do to help Edwin. George was beyond devastated. He had lost his wife, 2 daughters, and now he was just counting the days until his only son passed away too. He felt totally powerless. But Edwin, despite hearing this grave news, was putting on a brave face. With his voice still hoarse from coughing, he asked his father if he had any whiskey. If his days were indeed numbered, well, they might as well enjoy the last few moments. George nodded and headed to the kitchen, and as he was taking glasses out of the cabinet for the whiskey, he heard a knock at the door, which was odd because it was well past midnight and he never had visitors this late. George set the glasses down, made his way to the door, and opened it up to see 6 of his neighbors standing there on the porch. One of them, an older woman with graying hair, said they'd heard that his son Edwin was sick, and a few of them had seen Dr. Metcalf come over earlier, and so they were concerned. But they said they were not just here to pay their condolences, they were here to try to save him. George had to stop himself from letting out a very bitter laugh. He already knew no one could help his son. No one had been able to help anybody else in his family when they had the White Death, and it was just a matter of time before his son died. But he let the neighbors inside anyway, if only because seeing a few familiar faces might lift his son's spirits. When George and the visitors rounded the corner into Edwin's room, most of the neighbors went to Edwin's bedside to say hello, but the older woman walked directly towards Dr. Metcalf and began speaking to him in a very hushed voice. George was curious, so he walked closer to listen, and he heard this woman tell Dr. Metcalf that she actually knew how to cure Edwin. The doctor told her that was not possible. Nobody could cure this sickness. But the woman said Edwin was not sick. He was actually cursed by a vampire. George watched Dr. Metcalf's face go red with anger. He told the woman that she was being absolutely ridiculous. The doctor then looked over at George like he wanted somebody to back him up here, but George was desperate enough to consider anything at this point, and as crazy as a vampire's curse sounded, he didn't think it was that far-fetched, and so he wanted to hear more from this woman. After all, the White Death had made his loved ones look like the life was being sucked out of them, almost like a vampire was draining their blood. And just earlier that night, Edwin had said something to George that totally caught him off guard when he said, "She was here, she haunts me." And so George wondered if maybe his son was referencing this vampire. And so George turned from the doctor to his son and asked him about what he had said earlier about somebody being in the room with him, somebody haunting him. And Edwin croaked out that earlier, when he was alone in the room, he had seen this woman standing in the corner of his bedroom, staring at him with cold, dead eyes. Now, he said he didn't know if this had been a dream or not, but it had felt so real that now he was scared to death from the experience. To George, his son's testimony only seemed to strengthen the neighbor's vampire theory. However, George told the older woman that he wanted proof that this really is what was going on, that a vampire was behind what was happening to his family. And so the older woman called over another one of the neighbors, a farmer that George sometimes shared crops with, and he told George and Dr. Metcalf that he'd seen cases like this before. He explained that sometimes when a person died, a dark supernatural force would take over their body and cause them to leech the life out of their surviving loved ones, even from beyond the grave. These people were not really dead, the farmer said. They were vampires. At this point, the older woman interrupted the farmer and said to figure out which one of George's deceased family members was the vampire, all they had to do was exhume the bodies of his wife and 2 daughters. If one of the women's bodies hadn't yet decomposed, or if her heart still contained blood, that was a telltale sign that she was the vampire. To George, this whole process sounded barbaric, and he couldn't bear the thought of seeing his wife and children's decomposing bodies. But for all he knew, his neighbors could be right, and this could be his only chance to save his only son. So George gave the neighbors his blessing to go dig up his family members' bodies, and then George turned to Dr. Metcalf and, said he couldn't go and see this, and so asked the doctor to please go to the graveyard on his behalf. That way the doctor could be his eyes and also be the voice of reason.
I'm Alice Levine.
And I'm Matt Ford, and we're the hosts of British Scandal.
Yes, indeed. In this series, a Derbyshire couple are bored of their curtain-twitching, lawn-mowing suburban life.
So they sell their house, build a yacht, and sail off around the world.
Which sort of sounds idyllic until a sperm whale sinks their boat and they begin to starve.
Oh yes, and they didn't bring a radio because real sailors don't use radios.
Right?
This is the story of Mrballen and Maurice Bailey.
And the 117 days they spent lost at sea.
Follow British Scandal wherever you get your podcasts or listen early and ad-free on Audible.
I'm Alice Levine.
And I'm Matt Ford, and we're the hosts of British Scandal.
Yes, indeed. In this series, a Derbyshire couple are bored of their curtain-twitching, lawn-mowing suburban life.
So they sell their house, build a yacht, and sail off around the world.
Which sort of sounds idyllic until a sperm whale sinks their boat and they begin to starve.
Oh yes, and they didn't bring a radio because real sailors don't use radios.
Right?
This is the story of Mrballen and Maurice Bailey.
And the 117 days they spent lost at sea.
Follow British Scandal wherever you get your podcasts or listen early and ad-free on Audible.
In 2021, a man is arrested in a Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be Irish orphan Arthur Knight.
I'm not Nicholas Rosie.
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley, for I Am Not Nicholas, the full story, and find out what happened next in Series 2, I Am Not Nicholas, The Trials. Across 3 brand new episodes, I'll take you inside the trials of Nicholas Rossi. We'll meet the women and detectives trying to bring him down, and the jurors who'll decide his fate. I even find myself being called to the witness stand.
I'm just concerned that I might come out with evidence that's not admissible, and if I do that, the trial collapses, all because of me.
That's I Am Not Nicholas, Series 1 and Series 2. You can binge all episodes early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts. In 2021, a man is arrested in a Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be an Irish orphan, Arthur Knight.
I'm not Nicholas Rosie.
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley, for I Am Not Nicholas. You can binge all episodes of Series 1 and 2 early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts.
A few minutes later, Dr. Metcalf trudged through the dirt, lagging behind the neighbors, as they made their way toward the Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Between the 7 of them, they had 3 small lanterns, one of which Dr. Metcalf was holding to light his way. As the doctor walked along, he could hear the neighbors up ahead of him whispering about this vampire and what they were going to do, and it was hard for the doctor not to feel totally annoyed, because he did not believe a curse was behind what was happening to George's family. But he reminded himself that George was utterly desperate, and had really kind of convinced himself that maybe this curse really was the thing. And Dr. Metcalf didn't have the heart to just completely shoot it down. And so if this is what it took, going along with the neighbors to the graveyard to prove that George's son Edwin was not suffering from some kind of ridiculous curse, then ultimately this was worth it. Eventually, the neighbors and the doctor reached the cemetery's iron gates, which creaked as the farmer pushed them open. To the right of the entrance, Dr. Metcalf could see a stone crypt, and next to it, he could see the Brown family's plot. And it didn't take long for the group to locate the tombstones they were looking for. Dr. Metcalf stood a few feet away and watched while 2 of the neighbors held up lanterns and 3 others stuck shovels into George's wife's grave. They threw dirt to the side until eventually they unearthed her wooden coffin. The leader of the neighbors, the older woman who brought up the vampire curse, unlatched the casket, pulled it open, and revealed the dusty skeleton of George's late wife. She'd been dead for 9 years, and so her body had, like Dr. Metcalf had expected, totally decomposed. To the neighbors, though, this only meant that George's wife was not the vampire, but one of the 2 daughters was. So they reburied the wife and dug up George's first daughter, the one who had died just a few months after George's wife. And again, when they opened up the coffin, it was just full of bones, and so they reburied the daughter as well. And then finally, the neighbors exhumed Mercy, the second daughter, who had died just 8 weeks earlier. And what they found inside of her casket struck even Dr. Metcalf, the most skeptical person there, as absolutely inexplicable. Despite having been dead for 2 full months by this point, Mercy's body had not even begun to decompose. And to make things even stranger, Mercy's body was lying on its side, as if she had literally turned over in her grave after being buried. The gray-haired woman turned to Dr. Metcalf and pointed and said, "Look, there's your vampire." The doctor, who was admittedly kind of shaken up, still insisted there had to be some kind of rational medical explanation for this, but the neighbors wouldn't listen. They had already begun performing a ritual that they believed would kill the vampire, break the curse, and save Edwin's life. The neighbors gathered up twigs and arranged them on top of a nearby boulder. Then the farmer flicked a match and kindled the flame into a small bonfire. And then Dr. Metcalf watched in stunned silence as the older woman pulled something out of a bag that she'd carried into the cemetery. and in the flickering light, he saw a flash of silver, and he realized what the woman had pulled from her bag was a huge kitchen knife. And then Dr. Metcalf looked on in horror as the woman stuck that blade directly into Mercy's abdomen, slicing her stomach open, and then the woman reached up under Mercy's ribs and pulled out her liver and her heart. And then after opening them up, both organs were indeed still full of coagulated blood, as though Mercy's body had been using these organs recently. At this point, the old woman placed Mercy's organs on top of the fire and let them burn down to ash. But after that, the ritual was not done. The older woman pulled something else out of her bag. It was a jar full of water, and she unscrewed the cap. Then she scooped the ashes of the organs and put them into this water, then closed the jar and shook up the contents. The woman said the ritual was almost complete. All they needed to do now was have Edwin drink this entire concoction of water and his sister's burned organs. The neighbors turned and began marching out of the cemetery, and Dr. Metcalf, who was still just shocked by everything he had just seen, kind of chased after them, begging them to stop, but none of them even looked back. They were on a mission. A little while later that evening, Edwin was propped up in bed, feeling lifeless and miserable, surrounded by his father, Dr. Metcalf, and the group of neighbors. Edwin held the jar of black liquid in his hands, but he hadn't drunk any of it yet. Instead, he listened as Dr. Metcalf and the older woman argued. Dr. Metcalf said that if Edwin drank that, it would only make him sicker. But the older woman insisted it was the only medicine that would cure him. Edwin looked to his father for some advice about what to do, but George told Edwin it was up to him. Staring at the watery ashes of his own sister's heart and liver, Edwin almost began to gag. He couldn't decide what to do. If he drank this vile liquid, he could die, but if he didn't drink it, he would still very likely die. So he ultimately decided he had nothing to lose. He unscrewed the jar's cap, brought the black water to his lips, and began to drink. But despite drinking his sister's burned liver and heart, 2 months after this ritual, Edwin still died of the White Death. The ritual had not worked. And after losing his only son, George Brown's life continued to get worse. Over the next 6 years, 3 more of his daughters would die of the White Death, leaving him with only one child, his daughter Hattie. George lived another 2 decades. However, his one remaining child, Hattie, would outlive George by about another 40 years. She would die in 1954, but she lived long enough to actually see a cure developed for the White Death, because it would turn out the White Death was not some curse caused by a vampire. It was actually a very common and very deadly infectious disease called tuberculosis, and by 1954, a vaccine had been developed. But back in the late 1800s, tuberculosis was a global epidemic. It was highly infectious, often spreading amongst families or other tight-knit social groups, and it accounted for 25% of all deaths in the northeastern United States, where the Brown family lived. But despite how common it was, tuberculosis was very poorly understood. There were many different types, and the symptoms could vary widely, so it wasn't always accurately diagnosed. And even when it was, there was no effective medications, so treatment was mostly guesswork. Although almost everyone in New England at the time knew someone who had died of tuberculosis, the Brown family had a uniquely horrible experience. They lived in an isolated, half-abandoned community where superstition reigned. So when they started coming down with the so-called White Death, which was a nickname for tuberculosis, their neighbors thought they'd become the victim of a vampire, and when they exhumed Mercy and found that her body had not decomposed, they took that as proof that she possessed supernatural powers and was behind the curse. But just like Dr. Metcalf suspected on the night where they exhumed her, there actually was a rational explanation for why Mercy's body had not decomposed. Mercy died in the middle of the harsh New England winter when the ground was so frozen that it would have been impossible to actually dig a grave. So instead of being buried underground in the cemetery next to her mother and sister, she was still buried in the cemetery, but above ground in that stone crypt, where her body was naturally frozen and preserved. As for why her body appeared to have rolled over inside of her coffin, that was most likely because the neighbors had moved the casket as they opened it and sort of accidentally shifted her remains. However, Mercy's reputation as a vampire lived on, and her story made headlines all across the country, and in fact, in 1896, one article about Mercy the Vampire made it into the hands of an aspiring novelist named Bram Stoker. He would release Dracula 1 year later, and the book featured a young woman who was turned into a vampire and later had her body exhumed. The character's name was Lucy, a combination of Mercy and her middle name, which was Lena.
On a cold January morning, the fire captain zigzagged through an upscale neighborhood in Washington, D.C. As the fire truck sped past stately homes and manicured mansions, the captain could see people peering out their windows. In a quiet area like this, the sound of sirens was infrequent and unusual. And today, the call that the fire captain and his crew were responding to was something even they rarely had to address. Because this call wasn't in response to a fire or a traffic accident or even a cat stuck in a tree. But the woman who called 911 sounded terrified, and she begged the dispatcher to send help right away. 6 lives depended on it. Now, the fire captain pushed himself to focus and concentrate on the dangerous task ahead. From Ballen Studios in Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, kindly offer to babysit for the follow button, and then right before the follow button comes home at bedtime, make sure to feed all their kids tons of sugar. This episode is called False Alarm. On the morning of December 18th, 2020, 50-year-old Brooke Stroud wandered into her spacious kitchen in Washington, D.C., where she lived with her husband, Stefan, and their 3 young adult children. Brooke shook her head and tried to concentrate as she searched for the cup of coffee she'd brewed earlier. She hadn't been herself the last few days. Her head felt foggy, and little things, like where she'd put her coffee, had been slipping her mind. Brooke spotted the cup in a corner right near their large Viking stove. She grabbed it and headed out of the kitchen and into the formal living room. She slipped on a jacket and went out to the backyard, making a beeline for the separate guest house where she'd set up a home office. It was 9 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, and most businesses all over the country were shut down. Brooke was a clinical psychologist, and she had switched all her in-person sessions to Zoom. This morning, she had a group call, so she set her mug down at her wooden desk, turned on her laptop, and logged into her meeting. As Brooke said hello to the other participants, a wave of exhaustion suddenly washed over her. Her head felt heavy, and every bone in her body was suddenly aching. A scary thought crossed Brooke's mind. Maybe she'd finally gotten COVID, a disease that had already killed 350,000 people in the United States alone. She tried to power through the meeting, but all she could think about was how awful she felt. And so after only a few minutes of being in this meeting, she told everybody on the call that she just wasn't feeling well and asked if they could actually reschedule. After logging out of the Zoom call, Brooke took a minute to collect herself. She didn't think her symptoms seemed like COVID, so she wondered if maybe she was just overdoing it and was maybe tired from the stress of her job. She loved her work, but her hours have been crazy since the pandemic started. More people than ever were turning to therapy to get through these very difficult times. So she decided to cancel the rest of her sessions for the day and just go get some rest. She took the familiar path out of the guest house, through the backyard, and into the main house, walking more slowly than usual. Brooke climbed the winding staircase up to the second floor and into the master bedroom. There she climbed into bed, hoping to sleep off her weariness. Hours later, around noon, Brooke blinked her eyes open. Groggily, she sat up and felt around the bed. Her crisp white sheets were now totally damp with sweat. Brooke touched her forehead and realized she was burning up. She stumbled out of her bed and into the bathroom to take her temperature, and she saw it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and so she knew she was officially sick. Brooke tried to figure out what to do. She needed to get herself tested for COVID as soon as possible, but at-home COVID tests were not available at this time, which meant she'd have to set up an appointment with her doctor. Until she had the results, she could stay in her bedroom to avoid infecting her family potentially, but then she realized it was likely too late to actually isolate herself. Her youngest kids, 19-year-old Alex and 17-year-old Olivia, had come home from college and boarding school for the holidays a few days earlier, and they were probably already exposed to whatever Brooke had. So she decided it likely made the most sense to just kind of go about her day as usual, but at the same time try to keep her distance from the kids and her husband. So Brooke put her hair up in a messy bun and headed downstairs. A few hours later, Brooke gathered everyone for dinner. She sat at one end of their long table, while Stefan and the kids were at the other. Brooke wasn't up to cooking, so she ordered takeout from an Italian place, and the table was overflowing with pastas and salads. Alex and Olivia piled their plates high. They always had big appetites when they came home after months of school cafeteria food. Brooke was glad to see her kids eating, but for her, her fever was still burning, and she felt barely hungry at all. She pushed her pasta around her plate as her kids talked about what their semesters had been like with all the COVID protocols. Alex went to college in North Carolina, and Olivia was a high school senior at the same all-girls boarding school in Virginia that Brooke had actually attended. Brooke's oldest child, Sebastian, went to college in Vermont and wouldn't be home for a few days. Brooke really hoped she'd feel better by then, so they could all spend the holidays together, stress-free. Alex looked excited as he told them all about school, but Brooke could see the sadness in Olivia's eyes as she talked about the way COVID restrictions had basically ruined campus life. Normally, she played on a few different sports teams, but the pandemic had put all of them on hold. Brooke felt sorry for Olivia. Even though the pandemic was hurting everybody, she knew her daughter was having an especially hard time. She had looked forward to being a senior for so long, and now that she was, everything seemed to be falling apart. But Brooke's job was to be Olivia's mom, not her therapist, and they were all trying to figure out how to adjust to this new normal. After everyone was done eating, Brooke suggested they watch an old Christmas movie. Brooke took a seat at the opposite end of the couch from Stefan and the kids, and then willed herself to stay awake. Even after napping for several hours that day, she was still exhausted. About halfway through the movie, Brooke noticed her husband massaging his temples, and he also had a strained look on his face. She asked him what was wrong, and he explained his head was pounding. Brooke suggested he go check his temperature. Maybe he had a fever too. They paused the TV, and Stefan headed upstairs, holding onto the banister for support. A few minutes later, Brooke heard him vomiting. So she mustered what little strength she had left and ran up to find him leaning over the toilet bowl. She rubbed Stefan's back, trying to soothe him, but then she heard Alex and Olivia yell for her. Brooke told her husband she'd be right back, and she retraced her footsteps back to the living room. There, she found Alex and Olivia lying on the couch, clutching their heads in their hands as well. They complained that they also had terrible headaches. Brooke turned to go get them some water from the kitchen, while Alex shot up from the couch and ran to the guest bathroom. A second later, Brooke heard him retching too. And as if on cue, Olivia started dry heaving as well. Brooke ran to the kitchen at this point and grabbed a trash can, and she made it back to the living room just in time to set the bin in front of her daughter as she threw up all of her dinner. The following afternoon, Brooke and Stefan sat next to each other inside of a small exam room at their family doctor's office. Brooke had woken up that morning feeling like she'd barely gotten any sleep, even though she'd slept through the entire night, and the rest of her family felt just as bad, so Brooke had decided to get herself and Stefan checked for COVID. Brooke pulled her mask down under her nose, leaving just enough room for the nurse to insert a long nasal swab into her left nostril. It went so far back that it felt like Brooke's brain was being tickled. Her eyes teared up at the sensation, and she stifled a sneeze. The nurse rotated the swab around her nose for several seconds until it was coated with fluid, and then she repeated the same thing in Brooke's right nostril. And then she did the whole process all over again for Stefan. The nurse explained it would take about 24 hours for them to receive the test results by email. Then she took the swabs and left the room, while Brooke and Stefan checked out at the front desk. The next day, December 20th, 2020, Brooke stared at an email she had gotten from her doctor on her phone. She and Stefan were both negative for COVID, which was great, but they still felt horrible, and so clearly they were sick with something. Brooke decided to call Alex and Olivia's pediatrician to see if the kids should get tested for COVID too. But their doctor explained that it probably didn't make sense since Brooke and Stefan already tested negative. Whatever germs they had would have already infected the kids, but very, very likely it was not COVID. So the doctor recommended that everybody in the family just stay home, get some rest, drink lots of fluids, and surely this whole thing will just pass. However, a few days later, Brooke woke up aching all over still. Her fever had stayed steady at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, clouding her mind. The rest of her family felt just as bad too. Their headaches had never really gone away, and some mornings they still woke up feeling very nauseous. But Brooke fought through the fatigue and dragged herself out to her office in the guest house. She knew she was supposed to focus on resting and powering up her immune system, but she felt a responsibility to her clients. Her family was not the only one struggling right now during this weird holiday season. So Brooke settled in at her desk and logged into her first Zoom call. And as she took notes and chatted with other clients throughout the day, she felt herself perk up a bit. Slowly, her headache subsided, and the exhaustion that had usually overpowered her these last few days began to lift. Brooke thought about how good it felt to focus on other people for a change. Around 5 p.m., she wrapped up her sessions and made her way back to the house. She felt optimistic for the first time in a while that maybe she was finally getting over this illness. And so, Brooke, feeling really good, decided she would surprise the family by cooking a nice dinner. An hour later, Brooke called her whole family over to the dining room. She'd grilled some nice, thick steaks, figuring they could all use the protein. Brooke smiled as she doled out plates of food, silently telling herself that they would all be better by Christmas. She'd gotten sick before everybody else, so it made sense that she was recovering sooner too. But as Brooke took a bite of this food she made, she suddenly felt all that heaviness in her head and body start to creep back in. She told herself it was nothing, ignoring the queasiness that was growing in her stomach, and she managed to swallow a few bites of food before she just gave up. And she could see that the rest of her family also could not stomach their food either. Brooke watched Olivia push her salad around listlessly. She was usually so bubbly and full of life, but tonight, just like the rest of them, she looked defeated. Brooke sighed and began clearing their plates covered with uneaten food. After cleaning up, it took all the strength she had left just to shuffle upstairs and fall into her bed.
In 2021, a man is arrested in a Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be an Irish orphan, Arthur Knight.
Are we not Nicholas Rosie?
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley, for I Am Not Nicholas. You can binge all episodes of Series 1 and 2 early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts. In 2021, a man is arrested in a Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be Irish orphan Arthur Knight.
Are we not Nicholas Rosie?
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley, for I Am Not Nicholas, the full story, and find out what happened next in Series 2, I Am Not Nicholas, The Trials. Across 3 brand new episodes, I'll take you inside the trials of Nicholas Rossi. We'll meet the women and detectives trying to bring him down, and the jurors who'll decide his fate. I even find myself being called to the witness stand.
I'm just concerned that I might come out with evidence that's not admissible. And if I do that, the trial collapses, all because of me.
That's I Am Not Nicholas, Series 1 and Series 2. You can binge all episodes early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts.
I'm Alice Levine.
And I'm Matt Ford, and we're the hosts of British Scandal.
Yes, indeed. In this series, a Derbyshire couple are bored of their curtain-twitching, lawn-mowing suburban life,
So they sell their house, build a yacht, and sail off around the world.
which sort of sounds idyllic until a sperm whale sinks their boat and they begin to starve.
Oh yes, and they didn't bring a radio because real sailors don't use radios.
Right?
This is the story of Mrballen and Maurice Bailey.
And the 117 days they spent lost at sea.
Follow British Scandal wherever you get your podcasts or listen early and ad-free on Audible.
I'm Alice Levine.
And I'm Matt Ford, and we're the hosts of British Scandal.
Yes, indeed. In this series, a Derbyshire couple are bored of their curtain-twitching, lawn-mowing suburban life,
So they sell their house, build a yacht, and sail off around the world.
which sort of sounds idyllic until a sperm whale sinks their boat and they begin to starve.
Oh yes, and they didn't bring a radio because real sailors don't use radios.
Right?
This is the story of Mrballen and Maurice Bailey.
And the 117 days they spent lost at sea.
Follow British Scandal wherever you get your podcasts or listen early and ad-free on Audible.
The next afternoon, December 23rd, Brooke heard the front door open. She'd spent all morning in bed, but now she gathered the energy to limp down the stairs to the foyer, her muscles weak from this mystery illness and lack of physical activity. Her hair was matted, and she was wearing the same sweatpants and sweatshirt she'd been in for the past few days. But she managed a weak smile at the sight of her son, Sebastian, standing there with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, finally home from his college in Vermont. He looked fit and healthy, the rosiness in his cheeks a stark contrast to the paleness of her own face. She'd warned Sebastian that his family was not feeling well, but he joked that, nobody was feeling well these days. After all, it's the pandemic. And he said he would rather get sick at home than spend the holidays somewhere else without his family. Brooke stood at the bottom step, trying to keep her distance from her son, even as she told him how happy she was that he was home. But Sebastian just laughed and pulled her into a big bear hug. Brooke allowed him to wrap his arms around her, a sense of relief washing over her. A few hours later, the whole family sat in the living room eating cheese and crackers, while Sebastian told them all about his fall semester at college. As he described the off-campus house where he lived, Brooke saw Sebastian slowly sink into the couch, and his voice started to sound fatigued. She asked him if he felt okay, and Sebastian said he was just tired from finishing up his last paper for school and then catching a flight home. Brooke smiled and suggested he go to his room and get some rest. But inside, Brooke started worrying that Sebastian might be coming down with this same mystery illness that was dogging the rest of them. A couple of days after Christmas, Brooke's daughter Olivia woke up with a throbbing headache just as she had every morning since coming home. Her muscles still ached and she still didn't feel rested at all. In fact, it felt like she could sleep for another 5 hours, and even that probably wouldn't be enough. Olivia looked around her room, noticing all the tissues and dirty clothes she had scattered on the carpet. Usually she kept her space very nice and tidy, but she didn't have the energy or motivation to clean or do much of anything, really. So far, her winter break had been a total disaster. Olivia had expected the holidays to be different because of the COVID pandemic, but she'd hoped to have at least some fun. Now, the only silver lining was her upcoming trip to visit Caroline, her best friend from school who lived in New Orleans. Then, the plan was for them to fly back to DC together and spend 2 more weeks in isolation at Olivia's house. Their boarding school wanted all students to quarantine before returning for the spring semester, so they were going to do that together in DC. But Olivia was now worried that the family's mystery illness could ruin her visit to Caroline's house too. So, Olivia asked her parents to please set up an appointment with her pediatrician that afternoon. If doctors could just figure out what was making her sick, maybe Olivia could get the right treatment in time to go visit her friend. The next day, Olivia sat down next to her very ragged-looking mom at the kitchen table. Brooke blew on the steaming cup of tea in front of her, cooling it down before taking a long sip. She had purple bags under her eyes and her hair was a total mess. Olivia obviously knew her mom was not feeling great, none of them were, but she needed her mom's attention right now. She gathered up her willpower, pushing away the nausea and exhaustion she felt, and reminded herself of the argument she'd practiced. She was determined to see her friend Caroline and get back to living her life. First, Olivia gave her mom a rundown of her visit to the pediatrician the previous day. Dr. Stein had given her a COVID test just to be safe. She also checked for parvovirus, which causes mild respiratory illness, and Epstein-Barr virus, a common illness that would be making Olivia very drowsy. Olivia explained to her mom that all the results had come back negative. Then, before Brooke could even respond, Olivia launched into the speech she'd prepared. She told her mother, since she didn't have any of those viruses or COVID, she should be able to go see Caroline. All she was doing here was sitting at the house and watching TV, and after saying this, Olivia just went quiet and watched her mom consider her words. She could see the wheels in her mother's mind turning, and for a moment, it seemed like her mom might actually agree with her. But before Olivia could celebrate her victory, her mom's face got serious, and she began to speak in a very soft voice. Brooke explained that she, Olivia, her daughter, was already sick, and she couldn't risk traveling and getting worse, even if she didn't know what the sickness was. Olivia immediately huffed in frustration and thought about arguing more with her mom, but as upsetting as this was, she knew her mom was right. She did feel terrible, and clearly whatever she had likely was contagious because her whole family had it. So Olivia turned and headed up the stairs to her bedroom, her breathing ragged and her spirits deflated. Brooke sighed as she heard Olivia kind of stomping around upstairs, obviously still very upset, and Brooke couldn't help but feel sorry for her teenage daughter. This holiday season wasn't what any of them were expecting, but it seemed like Olivia was really taking it the hardest. She thrived on interacting with people, and she had already been through a semester at school full of remote classes and social distancing because of COVID. This trip to New Orleans was supposed to be her big chance to go have some fun and explore a new city with a very close friend. Brooke wondered if there was anything she could do to salvage the rest of Olivia's break. She stood up from the couch, fighting off the dizziness that came whenever she moved too quickly, and just then a thought crossed her mind. Brooke grabbed her phone off the coffee table and made her way outside to the backyard and began looking through her contacts until she found the name John Schifflian, who was Caroline's dad. Brooke paced around the garden as she spoke to John, savoring the fresh air, and she explained to him what had been going on at her house and that unfortunately Olivia was too sick to travel to New Orleans to see Caroline. Brooke was very clear that her whole family had the same bug as Olivia and that doctors had been unable to figure out what it was, but they did eliminate COVID-19. It was not that. Then Brooke made her pitch to John. Instead of having her daughter Olivia fly to New Orleans, she suggested that Caroline come to stay with them in Washington, D.C. If Caroline came here, she and Olivia could spend time together and hole up in the house and do their required 2 weeks of quarantine before returning to school together. Now, Brooke knew that a lot of parents would immediately reject the idea of sending their child to a house where everybody is sick. But Caroline's father, John Schifflian, was no ordinary parent. He was an infectious disease specialist at Tulane University's medical school. He studied survivors of some of the world's worst infectious diseases, and probably had more information about COVID-19 than anyone else Brooke knew. And so if he was okay with Caroline coming to DC, Brooke was confident that it really was safe. After Brooke made her pitch, there was a few moments of awkward silence, and then John responded. It was widely understood that the longer somebody was sick, whether with COVID or something else, the less infectious the illness becomes to others. If Caroline visited, she likely wouldn't get sick at all, or she'd get a milder version of whatever Brooke's family had. Regardless, she wouldn't be in any significant danger. And also, John knew his daughter would totally go for this idea. She wanted to see her friend. And so ultimately, John agreed to the idea. Brooke thanked John and assured him that she'd do everything she could to make sure Caroline was safe. John thanked her, and then they hung up, and then Brooke practically ran into the house to tell her daughter the great news. A few days later, in early January of 2021, Brooke made her way to the front door of her house. Before she could reach for the handle, Olivia came bolting out of the kitchen and shooed her mom out of the way with more energy than Brooke had seen in weeks. Her daughter was practically jumping with excitement. Olivia threw open the door and immediately wrapped her arms around Caroline. As Brooke watched her daughter light up, she told herself this was the right decision. She turned to Caroline and told her she was welcome to take her mask off. She'd be here for the next 2 weeks anyway, and her dad was aware of the situation. Caroline and Olivia grinned at each other, then they took Caroline's bag and headed upstairs to Olivia's room. A few hours later, Brooke was sitting in the guest house catching up on her paperwork when her daughter Olivia came rushing inside. In a panicked voice, she explained that Caroline had a splitting headache and was currently in the bathroom throwing up. Brooke shot out of her chair, dizziness and anxiety bubbling up inside of her at the same time. Brooke couldn't believe what she'd done. She'd promised John that his daughter would be safe here. Now she was just as sick as the rest of them. Brooke followed Olivia out of the guest house and back to the main house, fighting off dizzying vertigo with every step. The next evening, on January 5th, 2021, Brooke stood outside the bedroom where Caroline was staying. She was trying to figure out if Caroline was asleep or not. Brooke gently knocked, and a few seconds later, Caroline opened up. Brooke realized that Caroline was actually on a video call on her phone, and she quickly apologized, saying she could come back later. But Caroline said don't worry about it, she was on the phone with her dad. Seizing the opportunity, Brooke asked if she could speak to him for a second. Caroline handed over the phone, and Brooke told John she was absolutely mortified at the way his daughter's visit had gone so far. She repeated the apologies she'd been giving Caroline ever since she got sick. But John just waved her apology away. He said it was okay, he'd been the one who signed off on this trip, and he knew that the whole family was sick. And so Brooke felt her anxiety ease a little bit. At least John was not openly blaming her for what was going on with Caroline. However, John wasn't quite finished with his response. He did want to call to Brooke's attention something that Caroline had brought up to him, something very important. Caroline had told him that her symptoms lessened whenever the girls went for a walk around the neighborhood. She also said that people seemed to get very sick very quickly when they came into the main house. That suggested to John that this was not an infectious disease. John thought it was much more likely that it was some kind of environmental illness, meaning there was something in the house doing it. And John actually had a sneaking suspicion about which environmental illness it was. So he recommended that Brooke go to the hardware store as soon as possible. There she could buy a device that would prove John's theory. Brooke was shocked at what she was hearing, but she promised John she would go to the store first thing tomorrow morning, and then she passed the phone back to Caroline, anxious but excited that they might actually finally figure out what was making everybody sick. The next morning, January 6th, 2021, Stefan returned home from the hardware store with this new device in hand. Brooke grabbed her husband by the arm and rushed him inside, eager to see if Caroline's father had been right. She grabbed the device from Stefan and then hit the on button. And right away, the machine began blaring. The kids ran downstairs, shouting over the alarm to ask what was going on. Brooke pointed to the device and told Stefan to explain it to them as she fumbled with her phone. She very quickly dialed 911 and ran out into the yard, explaining to the dispatcher what was going on through panicked breaths. She pleaded with them to hurry. Within minutes, Brooke heard sirens. She rushed to the door and hurried the firefighters inside, showing them the device that was still going off. The uniformed men yelled over the alarm and instructed everyone to go outside and wait while they dealt with whatever was going on inside the house. Brooke ushered Stefan and the kids out the door and across the street. Pretty soon, curious neighbors were standing in small clusters all along the sidewalk, their eyes wide as they took in all the emergency vehicles before them. As they watched the commotion unfold, Brooke turned to Caroline and asked her to call her father. She wanted to tell John he was right. The firefighters would discover that Brooke's family had a serious carbon monoxide leak in their home, and everyone, including Caroline, had carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide, or CO for short, is an odorless, colorless gas that kills hundreds of people every year. When somebody has carbon monoxide poisoning, what happens is the carbon monoxide in the air replaces the oxygen in their bloodstream. As a result, the heart, brain, and body are starved of the oxygen they need to survive. The firefighters who responded to Brooke's call quickly figured out that the leak was coming from the basement furnace. A clamp had come loose and was spewing carbon monoxide throughout the 4-story house. That explained why Brooke felt better every time she worked in the guest house, and why Olivia and Caroline had fewer symptoms whenever they were out walking around in the neighborhood. Brooke was shocked that their smoke alarm already in the home didn't warn them about the poisonous gas exposure, but after inspecting the alarm, she realized it didn't have a CO detector at all. It had been installed a year before Washington, D.C. required them in all residences. In the end, Brooke's family and Caroline all recovered well from the CO poisoning. After the leak, Brooke bought 4 plug-in detectors that she installed on each level of the house, but every time she goes into the basement, she can't help but check to see that the furnace is still properly connected.
Just before dawn on a cool fall morning, cars full of federal agents pulled into the parking lot of what looked like an abandoned strip mall. They parked outside of a brown brick building and waited until the final vehicle had arrived. When the team leader gave the go-ahead, the agents leapt out of their cars and headed inside, flashing their badges. Most of the agents immediately fanned out as the team leader strode right up to the receptionist and delivered a search warrant. These agents were on the hunt for a killer, and they expected to find evidence here at this industrial laboratory in a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. As the receptionist began frantically calling the executives who ran this facility, the lead investigator looked around, and he saw the dingy linoleum on the floor, and the yellowed ceiling panels overhead, and the visible layer of dust on a nearby desk. He had been in plenty of laboratories over the years, and typically they were all kept in immaculate condition, but this place was not. The investigator stepped aside as the other agents strode through the facility, hurrying to grab files before employees could shred them, and to save vials of liquid before lab techs could dump them out. This was easily the most disgusting laboratory the lead investigator had ever stepped foot in. But he had to keep searching this building, or more lives would be lost. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mrballen, and this is Mrballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, kindly gift the follow button a trip to Los Angeles, but don't tell them they'll be staying at the Cecil Hotel. This episode is called Root of All Evil. It was a humid Saturday afternoon in August of 2012. 55-year-old Thomas Rybinski stood at the helm of his boat, steering it across the lake near his home in Tennessee. He'd spent all day on the water with his wife Colette and a few friends, and it had been the perfect day for boating. Hot and steamy, but with a light breeze sweeping across the lake. Thomas couldn't believe that he'd almost canceled on his wife and friends that morning. He'd woken up with a headache and an upset stomach, but Colette had made him some coffee, which had helped him feel better, and once he was up and moving, Thomas felt okay, still a bit shaky, but good enough to keep their boating date with their friends. Thomas was actually accustomed to having to push through discomfort. He had chronic back pain from an old accident that flared up every time he rode his motorcycle, went on a strenuous hike, or really did any sort of strenuous activity at all. But Thomas loved exercising and being outdoors, and so he wasn't about to stop doing those things just because of a little backache. And he also got cortisone injections every month, which helped manage the pain in his back. Thomas was feeling especially grateful to be boating as he looked out over the bow, navigating the boat around a corner toward a little cove. Once he was in the cove, he dropped the anchor, and Colette started unpacking the food they'd brought for dinner. A few hours later, Thomas was halfway through a lively story about his recent hiking trip to Colorado when he felt a tap on his arm. It was Colette, and he knew she was giving him the signal that it was about time to head back. Thomas looked up and realized the sun was starting to set. He'd been having such a nice time, he really hadn't noticed how late it was getting, and he knew they wanted to be tied up at the dock by nightfall. So Thomas helped his wife pack up quickly, then he pulled up the anchor line and steered the boat back to shore. About a week later, on the following Friday morning, Thomas sat at his desk at General Motors, looking over a blueprint. For years, Thomas had worked as an automotive designer, and right now, he was designing a new vehicle interior. He doodled ideas on a spare sheet of paper as he brainstormed. But today, he was just drawing a blank. In fact, the only thing he could even think about was the pounding going on in his head. Last weekend's headache that almost made him cancel that boating outing had come back, and it actually had gotten worse and worse throughout this last week. Now the pain was sharp and persistent, like somebody was snapping a rubber band against his temples over and over again. Thomas put his elbows on his desk and cradled his face, trying to block out the stark overhead lighting in his office. Thomas hated the idea of leaving work early, but for the first time in years, he was debating whether or not he should go home sick. But ultimately, after rubbing his eyes and thinking about it for a second, he decided he would just try to tough it out. If he was going to have a headache, he figured he'd rather have it here, where at least he could attempt to kind of occupy his mind for a moment by working on a project that he loved. But once the clock in his office finally reached 5 p.m., Thomas was so ready to get out of there. He packed up and headed home for the weekend, glad to have the next 2 days to rest up and recharge. But that weekend, his headache didn't go away, and on Sunday morning, Thomas awoke to some of the worst pain he'd ever felt in his life. He turned over in bed and told Colette that it felt like the inside of his head was about to explode. Colette looked totally shocked, and Thomas knew why. He never complained about pain. So for him to say something like this meant it must be really serious. And so Thomas didn't even argue when Colette told him they had to go see a doctor. About an hour later, at the Vanderbilt University Medical Center, a doctor named Annie Wilkins walked into an exam room. Thomas was her first patient of the day. He was sitting on the exam table, clutching his head with his hands, while Colette rubbed his back. And so from the moment Dr. Wilkins saw Thomas, she could tell he was in immense pain. Dr. Wilkins asked Thomas to lift his head up for a moment so she could give him a routine examination. But as Dr. Wilkins moved her finger around in front of Thomas's face, she noticed that his eyes were struggling to follow it. In fact, it didn't seem like Thomas could focus on anything at all. That lack of focus, coupled with this extreme headache he was describing, made Dr. Wilkins suspect that Thomas had an infection in his brain, a condition called meningitis. She wondered if he had been exposed to something out of the ordinary that could cause meningitis, and so she asked him if he'd traveled anywhere new recently. Thomas nodded and said actually he'd just gotten back from a hiking trip in Colorado, and that was a red flag to Dr. Wilkins. Anytime a patient mentioned hiking, she knew that tick bites could be a factor. Ticks can be infected with bacteria and viruses and can spread diseases through their bites. Dr. Wilkins wondered if maybe Thomas had been bitten by a tick in Colorado and developed something called Rocky Mountain spotted fever, whose symptoms include meningitis. To find out, Dr. Wilkins told Thomas that he would need to undergo a spinal tap so the lab could study his spinal fluid for signs of disease. First, she wanted to know whether or not he had meningitis, and then also whether or not Rocky Mountain spotted fever caused the meningitis. Thomas grimaced at the thought of a needle going into his spine, but the doctor told him really it was no big deal and they would have answers soon. About 90 minutes later, Dr. Wilkins received the first results from the spinal tap. Thomas did indeed have meningitis. So Dr. Wilkins asked a nurse to start Thomas on antibiotics right away, which would help reduce the swelling around Thomas's brain and his spinal cord. But about an hour later, Dr. Wilkins got a surprise when the rest of Thomas's lab results came back. Thomas's spinal fluid showed that he did not have Rocky Mountain spotted fever. In fact, there was no trace of any bacteria or virus in his spinal fluid at all, which left Dr. Wilkins feeling totally perplexed. She had been fairly confident that Thomas would test positive for Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and if not that, then definitely some other virus or bacteria. After all, viruses and bacteria cause the vast majority of meningitis cases. Dr. Wilkins knew that other invaders can also cause the disease, such as parasites, but that usually only happened to people who traveled internationally. And in extremely rare cases, patients could get meningitis from a fungus that lives on unsterilized surgical equipment, but Thomas hadn't had any surgeries. So Dr. Wilkins was at a total loss as she walked back towards Thomas's room. She found him inside, lying awake in bed, with his wife Colette sitting nearby in a chair. Dr. Wilkins was relieved to see Thomas looking much more alert than when he'd come into the hospital a few hours ago. The antibiotics already seemed to be helping him. Colette stood to greet Dr. Wilkins and then quickly asked her if they knew what was wrong with her husband. But Dr. Wilkins had to be honest and said no, she didn't know yet. She was going to keep Thomas in the hospital for a few days. That way they could keep an eye on him as the antibiotics fought the infection. But she still did not know what had caused this infection in the first place. Over the next few days, Thomas steadily recovered, and on the 5th morning of his hospital stay, Dr. Wilkins was glad to see that Thomas was nearly back to his usual self. He wasn't in pain, and he no longer seemed groggy. Dr. Wilkins felt so confident about Thomas's condition that she actually discharged him from the hospital so he could finish recovering at home. 1 week later, on September 7th, an epidemiologist named Dr. April Petit returned to work at Vanderbilt University Medical Center after a week off. She began her day by looking over her patients' charts, and one caught her eye. Thomas Rybinski was back at the hospital and had just been transferred by Dr. Wilkins to Dr. Petit's care. Dr. Petit looked closer at his chart, and she saw that Thomas had been given a 2-week treatment of antibiotics to take at home, but after only a few days of that, he'd felt so sick that he had to come back to the hospital. Dr. Petit made her way to Thomas's room, and when she went inside, she saw Thomas laying in bed with a dazed look on his face. His wife Colette was sitting by his side, and she explained that Thomas had been acting confused all morning, and also, for the past few days, he'd been complaining of lower back pain. Dr. Petit nodded and then walked over to Thomas's bedside and gently asked him how he was feeling. And Thomas looked up at her, but he had this look on his face like he didn't understand the question. And then he just stayed silent. Dr. Petit frowned, knowing her job just got much more difficult because clearly Thomas was not going to be able to tell her exactly how he was feeling. All she'd have to go on was Thomas's medical records and anything Colette could tell her. Dr. Petit suspected that Thomas's meningitis must have flared up again. So she ordered an MRI of Thomas's spine and brain, as well as another spinal tap. She also started Thomas on a new cocktail of antibiotics, and she asked the lab to test his spinal cord fluid again to try to find the cause of this infection. Later that evening, Dr. Petit stopped by Thomas's room to check on him, and she was pleasantly surprised to see that he already seemed to be improving. But as she headed home that night, she couldn't help but still feel nervous for Thomas. After all, they thought he was getting better once before, and now he was back in the hospital, sicker than ever.
I'm Alice Levine.
And I'm Matt Ford, and we're the hosts of British Scandal.
Yes, indeed. In this series, a Derbyshire couple are bored of their curtain-twitching, lawn-mowing suburban life,
So they sell their house, build a yacht, and sail off around the world.
which sort of sounds idyllic until a sperm whale sinks their boat and they begin to starve.
Oh yes, and they didn't bring a radio because real sailors don't use radios.
Right?
This is the story of Mrballen and Maurice Bailey.
And the 117 days they spent lost at sea.
Follow British Scandal wherever you get your podcasts or listen early and ad-free on Audible.
I'm Alice Levine.
And I'm Matt Ford, and we're the hosts of British Scandal.
Yes, indeed. In this series, a Derbyshire couple are bored of their curtain-twitching, lawn-mowing suburban life,
So they sell their house, build a yacht, and sail off around the world.
which sort of sounds idyllic until a sperm whale sinks their boat and they begin to starve.
Oh yes, and they didn't bring a radio because real sailors don't use radios.
Right?
This is the story of Mrballen and Maurice Bailey.
And the 117 days they spent lost at sea.
Follow British Scandal wherever you get your podcasts or listen early and ad-free on Audible.
In 2021, a man is arrested in a Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be Irish orphan Arthur Knight.
I'm not Nicholas Rosie.
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley, for I Am Not Nicholas, the full story, and find out what happened next in Series 2, I Am Not Nicholas, The Trials. Across 3 brand new episodes, I'll take you inside the trials of Nicholas Rossi. We'll meet the women and detectives trying to bring him down, and the jurors who'll decide his fate. I even find myself being called to the witness stand.
I'm just concerned that I might come out with evidence that's not admissible. And if I do that, the trial collapses. All because of me.
That's I Am Not Nicholas, Series 1 and Series 2. You can binge all episodes early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts. In 2021, a man is arrested in a Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be an Irish orphan, Arthur Knight.
I am not Nicholas Rosie.
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley, for I Am Not Nicholas. You can binge all episodes of Series 1 and 2 early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts.
6 days later, on September 13th, Dr. Petit arrived for an early morning shift, feeling sleepy as she drank the last sips of the coffee she'd gotten on the way to work. The moment she sat down in her office, her pager went off, calling her to Thomas Rybinski's room. Dr. Petit had a bad feeling. Even though Thomas had improved slightly in his first afternoon back in the hospital, he was incoherent again by the next morning, just as Dr. Petit had feared. And he'd only been getting worse as the week wore on. When she arrived in his room and said hello to Thomas, she immediately noticed that the right side of his face was completely slack. His features were drooping, and Dr. Petit suspected that Thomas had suffered a stroke. And so she pressed the call button because Thomas would need a brain scan right now. An hour later, Dr. Petit received the brain scan results, which showed that the arteries at the back of Thomas's head were blocked. They also showed a pool of blood where Thomas's brain and spinal column met. Dr. Petit shook her head. Thomas definitely suffered a stroke. She knew that this damage was caused by something that was trying to invade Thomas's brain. But what was it? Thomas's spinal fluid was still free of bacteria and viruses. It made no sense. And yet there had to be some logical answer. Dr. Petit just needed to find it. The next morning, when Dr. Petit arrived at the hospital, she found a shocking lab result waiting for her. At last, she knew what was causing Thomas's meningitis. But the answer was truly bizarre. The infection came from a fungus that normally would not cause disease in healthy patients like Thomas, and so it seemed impossible. But the lab results were undeniable. A shiver ran down Dr. Petit's spine. Fungal meningitis is not only rare, but it's also deadly. Many patients die from it, even with proper treatment, and so Dr. Petit raced down the hall to order new medication for Thomas, hoping they were not too late. 5 days later, on September 18th, Dr. Petit sat in her office, combing through medical journals. She was still stunned over Thomas's diagnosis and was trying to find a published study that might help her understand how Thomas's brain had been invaded by fungus. But it was not until late afternoon that she finally landed on an article that piqued her interest. The article was about a cluster of fungal meningitis outbreaks that occurred following a devastating 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean. Following the tsunami, pregnant women began developing fungal meningitis after getting epidural shots in their spines with needles that had been stored in damp warehouses. The dampness turned out to be a breeding ground for fungus, which made these needles deadly. Dr. Petit wondered if something similar could have happened to Thomas, that he'd been injected with a fungus-covered needle. If that was the case, then other people might have gotten the same dangerous treatment. She began drafting an email to the Tennessee Department of Health. She needed to report Thomas's case right away. But as she typed, her pager went off. It was another alert about Thomas, and this time he was crashing. So Dr. Petit got up and raced out of her office and down the hall to Thomas's room, and when she went in there, she saw Colette in the corner crying, and a nurse who was right by Thomas's bedside preparing to intubate Thomas because Thomas had stopped breathing. That same afternoon, so on September 18th, Dr. Marion Kaner was answering emails from her desk at the Tennessee Department of Health, where she specialized in tracking infectious diseases. Dr. Kaner yawned and lifted her rimless glasses to rub her eyes. She was normally peppy and focused, but always seemed to get a bit tired when it was time to sign off for the day. But then an email labeled urgent popped into her inbox. The email was about Thomas Rybinski's rare case of fungal meningitis and his doctor's suspicion that it could have been caused by dirty needles. Dr. Petit had managed to stabilize Thomas, but he was in critical condition, and Dr. Petit was worried that others might get sick too. Initially, Dr. Kaner thought that Dr. Petit's worry about some kind of a fungal meningitis outbreak seemed far-fetched. That is, until she read a very interesting detail in Dr. Petit's letter. About 2 weeks before Thomas got sick, he had gone to a nearby clinic for a steroid injection to help with his chronic back pain. So it was at least possible that that clinic injected him with a dirty needle. Dr. Kaner was familiar with the clinic in question. She knew they saw about 160 patients each week, which meant that if one patient had been infected by a dirty needle, there were likely to be more cases. Dr. Kaner decided to launch an immediate investigation. Two days later, Dr. Kaner parked her car at the St. Thomas Pain Clinic, which was where Thomas had received his steroid injection. Earlier that morning, Dr. Kaner had received word that 2 additional patients had shown up at Tennessee hospitals with fungal meningitis, and both of them had also been treated at this St. Thomas Pain Clinic. Dr. Kaner called the clinic to inform them of the infections, as well as her suspicions that the pain clinic could be at fault. To her relief, the clinic director immediately volunteered to shut down until they could determine what was causing the meningitis. Dr. Kaner and a few colleagues got out of the car and walked inside the modern-looking clinic with big glass doors and tall windows. The clinic director came out into the waiting room to greet them. Dr. Kaner shook his hand and explained they would need to swab the entire clinic for signs of contamination. And the director said that was totally fine, take your time, and just said if you need anything from me, let me know. Dr. Kaner and her team followed the clinic director through the facility, which Dr. Kaner noticed was sparkling clean. The director showed her where supplies were kept, including syringes and needles. Then he walked them over to the industrial fridges where they kept the steroids and other medicines. The investigators took samples and got busy making sure everything was up to code. Meanwhile, Dr. Kaner kept an eye out for mold. She even got down on her hands and knees to inspect the refrigerators, but she found nothing. Dr. Kaner would still test the samples they'd collected, but she had to admit, the clinic appeared clean and safe. There were no expired steroids, no dirty instruments. It was clear the medical staff took great care of the place and followed protocol to a T. But for the purposes of Dr. Kaner's investigation, this actually was a big problem. Because if this clinic wasn't to blame for the 3 cases of fungal meningitis amongst the clinic patients, then something much bigger must be going on. Dr. Kaner thanked the clinic director before heading back to her office, knowing it was time to alert the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC, the agency that handles national disease outbreaks. A few days later, Dr. Kaner sat in a conference call with researchers from the CDC who were calling from their headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. After first contacting the CDC, Dr. Kaner had reached out to medical professionals all across the state. So far, she had received word of 1 confirmed death and 5 cases of suspected fungal meningitis. All of the cases were linked somehow to the St. Thomas Pain Clinic, but investigators couldn't find any source of contamination there. CDC investigators raised the possibility that the clinic could have received supplies that were already contaminated when they arrived, so they had started to carefully track these suppliers for every single item used at that clinic. They were checking not just the needles, but also the syringes, anesthetics, surgical dye, even the trays used to hold the instruments. But despite several days of work, they still had not found the source of infection yet. As Dr. Kaner listened in on this conference call, one of the investigators in Atlanta reminded everybody on the call that many of the patients at the St. Thomas Pain Clinic had received steroid injections to relieve their discomfort. So, if the clinic's needles weren't dirty, then maybe the problem was actually the steroids themselves. Another CDC official then added that it would be easy enough to check because all of the clinic's steroids had all come from the same place, the New England Compounding Center, or NECC for short, which was located in Framingham, Massachusetts. The CDC investigators said they should let NECC know which steroid batches were being linked to the meningitis cases. That way the company could recall the batches immediately. And so Dr. Kaner suddenly felt hopeful. She left the conference call feeling certain that NECC would recall the drugs and this meningitis scare would soon be over.
At 6 a.m. on October 2nd, so a couple of weeks after Dr. Kaner began her investigation, a U.S. Food and Drug Administration investigator named Stacy DeGarmo pulled into the NECC's parking lot. One of her colleagues sat in the passenger seat taking photographs. Thomas Rybinski, whose case started the investigation, had now passed away from his fungal meningitis. So now, at least 2 people in Tennessee had died after receiving the steroid injection compounded at the NECC, and there were 14 other cases identified across the nation. But it had the potential to get much, much worse because NECC shipped so many steroids all over the country. Dr. Kaner and the CDC investigators had learned that the NECC had distributed 17,675 vials of potentially contaminated steroids across 23 different states. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, had quickly gotten involved and almost immediately decided they needed to pay NECC a physical visit. Lead FDA investigator, DeGarmo, was certain she would find the answers they needed inside the sort of bland-looking brown brick building where the NECC was headquartered. As DeGarmo looked across the parking lot, she immediately saw something troubling. There was a huge construction vehicle, like an excavator, with a big mechanical shovel that was tearing in to a pile of construction debris and other trash, spreading dust all around. A mess like that has no business being outside of a building where drugs are made. DeGarmo shook her head and climbed out of her car. She'd never been to NECC, but she was not surprised when she'd gotten a call about them from the CDC. Her agency had a history of run-ins with NECC, including a time 10 years earlier when their steroids had given a few patients meningitis-like symptoms. So if these executives at NECC were up to no good, well, DeGarmo was thrilled to be the one to ruin their day. DeGarmo and her colleague walked into the ground floor laboratory of the NECC, where 2 company executives stood waiting for them. They didn't look particularly pleased to be up so early, especially to be giving a tour to 2 FDA investigators. Still, DeGarmo followed after one executive, while her colleague went with the other. The executive that DeGarmo had followed led her through the laboratory, and DeGarmo noticed right away that the facility was absolutely filthy. As DeGarmo looked over documents, her colleague zipped on a gown, put a respirator on her face, and entered the facility's clean room, where most of the facility's lab work took place. DeGarmo remained outside because she was pregnant, but she watched through a window as her colleague moved methodically around the room, wiping surfaces with a sponge. When she finished with each sponge, she dropped it into a sterile bag so that the sponge and whatever was on it could be tested later. From the door, DeGarmo could see that one of the ovens used to sterilize the NECC drugs was obviously covered in this sort of brown muck. She watched with disgust as her colleague carefully swiped the oven and then dropped that dirty sponge into a bag. 12 hours later, DeGarmo and her colleague were exhausted, but they still were not done combing through the NECC lab. They needed several more days to finish their investigation as NECC lawyers raised one objection after another. Finally, on the 3rd day of the FDA investigation into the NECC facility, NECC executives just straight up would not let DeGarmo back into the building. So the following week, on October 16th, Massachusetts health agents raided NECC, and they would make a staggering discovery. Not 1, but 3 batches of steroids made at NECC were found to be contaminated, meaning that tens of thousands of infected vials had been sent out across the country, including to the St. Thomas Pain Clinic in Tennessee. Overall, NECC was a sanitary nightmare. Not only was the lab dirty, but the owners of the manufacturing center also owned a waste management business that was right next door. And investigators found that NECC's whole operation was pretty much illegal. They were mass-producing drugs that they had no legal right to make. And when investigators looked even more closely, they found the NECC had actually created thousands of imaginary patients just to make it seem like their operation was legitimate. All told, more than 100 people died from NECC's contaminated steroids, and almost 800 other people got sick, in what was the worst pharmaceutical disaster in decades. NECC's supervising pharmacist, whose name was Glenn Chin, along with several other executives, were sent to jail over their role in creating the dangerous conditions in their facility. Prosecutors said they had all chosen profits over keeping patients safe. From Mrballen Studios and Wondery.
A woman in her 60s sat in the passenger seat of her car as her sister drove them both towards the hospital. And as they drove, the woman did her best not to look in the back seat. Because she knew what was waiting back there. Faces staring back at her. And not faces attached to bodies, just floating heads with menacing smiles. These faces had been following her for days. She saw them everywhere, even when she closed her eyes. But right now, she felt like as long as she kept her eyes straight ahead on the road, she wouldn't have to see them. And so as this woman stared unblinkingly ahead, she kept telling herself again and again that those faces couldn't hurt her because they weren't real. Even though every time she saw one of those floating faces, they sure seemed real to her, and somewhere deep down she knew these faces wanted something from her. She just didn't know what it was. From Mrballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies.
So, if you like today's story, the next time the follow button asks you for a Coca-Cola, say, "Is Pepsi okay?" And when they say, "Okay, yeah, sure," go ahead and bring them a Diet RC.
There's a common phrase that goes, "You have to see it to believe it." And when it comes to healthcare, you'd think that doctors and nurses have seen it all. But there are still some things that are just so crazy, so unexpected, that even the most seasoned medical professional can hardly believe their eyes. On today's episode, we have two medical stories that amazed both the patients and the medical staff alike. The first story is about a woman who can't seem to escape a malignant presence that follows her everywhere. And the second story is about a man who feared he was dying from lung cancer until his astonished doctors discovered what was really causing all of his issues. And now here's our first story called Faces Everywhere. On a Monday morning in March of 2005, a 67-year-old retired teacher named Jane Miller woke up at her home in Ohio. She yawned and stretched, feeling well rested after a relaxing weekend. The previous day, she'd gone to church with her family, then out to breakfast at their favorite diner, and she'd spent the rest of the day picking up around her house at a very leisurely pace. But after Jane sat up in her bed and rubbed her eyes and then opened them again, she yelped in shock. There, floating directly over her, was a disembodied head. Jane frantically reached over to her nightstand and grabbed her glasses. She slid them up her nose and looked again, hoping to see something different, i.e. not a floating face. But nope, it was definitely a floating face hovering right near the ceiling. And this face, in addition to being very odd because it's floating around in a room, also just looked totally bizarre. The head was shaped almost like a football, and it had piercing eyes and these yellowed buck teeth. And the face stared down at Jane with a hint of malice in its expression. Jane was obviously terrified. She leapt out of bed and raced downstairs to get away from this ghost in her room. Adrenaline was coursing through Jane's body as she fought to catch her breath, and when she reached the kitchen, she whipped around, and luckily, the ghost face was now gone and had not followed her. With shaking hands, she grabbed the phone and called her older sister, Melissa. She knew that if anybody would believe this story, it would be her big sister. 10 minutes later, Melissa flew down the street towards her sister's house, risking a speeding ticket in this residential neighborhood to get to Jane's house faster. She pulled into Jane's driveway and threw the car into park, and then ran up the walkway to Jane's house. The moment Melissa stepped inside of Jane's house, immediately something felt off. She couldn't explain it, there was just a coldness in the air. She called out for Jane and found her sister in the kitchen, still in her PJs, sitting in front of an uneaten bowl of cereal. It had been sitting there so long that the Cheerios were bloated and soggy. Jane looked up at Melissa, but her eyes were distant and her face was pale and scared as she whispered that the faces were now above her and beside her and everywhere else she looked. Melissa glanced around, but all she saw was the empty kitchen and her sister sitting there with her soggy bowl of cereal. And so Melissa just asked Jane, like, "Hey, are you feeling okay?" And Jane nodded and said, "I'm not crazy, I'm telling you the truth." And suddenly Melissa just felt so bad for Jane, and she assured her that, you know what, everything's gonna be fine. She told Jane, "I don't think you're crazy," but inside, Melissa thought, oh my goodness, something mentally could be wrong with her. And that's when a realization dawned on Melissa, and she felt a chill run up her spine. Melissa had read about this kind of thing on Facebook, and she knew exactly who she needed to call. The next day, Melissa was back at Jane's house, anxiously anticipating the arrival of her guest. Just then, she heard a knock at the door, and Melissa raced over to greet Father Raymond Smith. He'd been the pastor at Melissa's church for almost 15 years, and Melissa hoped he'd be able to help Jane. Melissa thanked Father Smith for coming over on such short notice, and she explained how worried she was for Jane, and invited him to follow her upstairs to Jane's bedroom. Father Smith smiled and told Melissa that whatever was going on with her sister, they would get to the bottom of it. Melissa crept up the stairs to Jane's bedroom with the sound of Father Smith's footsteps right behind her. And right as Melissa reached the top of the stairs and turned the corner into Jane's bedroom, a wave of icy cold seemed to hit her. To Melissa, it immediately seemed like malicious presences were hovering all around her sister, and they didn't like it when Melissa was in the room. Jane was lying in her bed, the covers pulled up to her face. Melissa knew her sister had her eyes closed under there because pitch darkness made it harder to see all the menacing faces all around her. Melissa quietly told Jane that help had finally arrived, and Jane, when she heard this, threw back the covers to see who was there. She blinked and said hello to Father Smith, though she was clearly surprised to see him there. Melissa smiled to herself because this had been her intention, to make sure the creatures that were menacing Jane had no idea who was coming over here. Melissa turned to Father Smith and invited him to begin. Then Melissa stood to the side while Father Smith shook Jane's hand and asked her to explain to him what had been going on over the past couple of days. Jane was a little embarrassed as she began to describe what she was seeing and what she was feeling, but Father Smith didn't actually seem to be listening. Instead, he was studying Jane's hands very carefully, and he was watching her expression and all of her bodily movements, and Melissa even wondered, what was he doing? Finally, after Jane stopped explaining what was going on with her, Father Smith told Jane why he was there. He said her sister, Melissa, had called him yesterday, worried that Jane was suffering from demonic possession. Melissa nodded in the corner. From the moment Jane had described the hallucinations to her, Melissa suspected that a dark entity was possessing her sister, and so she'd called Father Smith in the hopes that he could identify the demons and maybe perform an exorcism to get rid of them. Father Smith was the most devout priest Melissa had ever met. If he couldn't banish the demons back to hell, it was doubtful anybody else could. Except when Father Smith spoke again, he looked at Melissa and told her that he actually wasn't sure there were any demons to banish here. He explained that as Jane was speaking, he'd been trying to see if she had full control of her body, and from what he could tell, Jane was fully in charge of her movements. He hadn't seen any of the involuntary twitches or tics that typically accompany demonic possession. Then the father looked back at Jane and asked her to follow the movement of his finger as he whirled it all around in front of her. Father Smith just shook his head as he watched Jane follow his finger flawlessly, and then Father Smith said that, in his opinion, Jane needed to see a doctor, not an exorcist. Melissa was sort of dumbfounded and asked Father Smith if he was absolutely sure, and Father Smith said that, the dead giveaway to him at least was that Jane knew her hallucinations were not real. But Father Smith promised that if doctors could not figure out what was wrong with Jane, the church would call a certified exorcist who was properly trained within the Catholic Church, and that exorcist could examine Jane's psychological state and determine whether she was genuinely possessed or not. Melissa decided this was a good compromise and agreed to take Jane to a hospital right away. Father Smith thanked her and then offered to pray over Jane before he left. Melissa said that would be nice and prayed silently as Father Smith recited a blessing with his hands outstretched. Three days later, Dr. Randall Crane stood in a hospital room with Jane, watching her sketch a little doodle on his notepad. Dr. Crane was an internal medicine resident at the hospital, and Jane was the most fascinating patient he'd had in a long time. She'd been suffering from these crazy hallucinations for the past few days, and was scared that she was losing her mind. Now, Crane didn't know if that was actually true, that she was losing her mind, but he could not explain why she was hallucinating faces all the time, and so he couldn't rule out some form of dementia. And so Dr. Crane, kind of on a whim, had asked Jane to go ahead and sketch on his notepad what she was actually seeing, like draw the face. And so Jane finished sketching and handed the notebook back to Dr. Crane, and she warned him that she was no artist, but this is really what she was seeing floating over her head right now and all the time. Dr. Crane looked down at the doodle that Jane had drawn. The so-called demon face had an oblong, football-shaped head with big buck teeth and round, bulging eyes. It looked more like a Muppet than a monster. In all honesty, it actually reminded him of the main character in an old children's cartoon called Hey Arnold that the doctor had watched all the time when he was a kid. But even if the sketch was sort of funny, he took Jane's condition very seriously. He clearly understood why she'd be terrified to see something like this following her around all the time. And so Dr. Crane asked Jane a few questions, like whether these hallucinations had spoken to her, or if she was experiencing headaches, fever, or seizures around the time these hallucinations appeared, and she said no to all of them. And so Dr. Crane told Jane not to worry. He was going to order some routine blood work to see if maybe she had an infection, and he also ordered a toxicology screening just to rule out any bad drug interactions. An hour later, Jane sat on the examination table feeling very anxious. Dr. Crane told her that all her tests had come back normal, which actually initially made Jane more nervous. She wondered if now she and Melissa would have to call that certified exorcist after all. But Dr. Crane did not seem like he was totally confused. He actually said, "Jane, I want to look at your eyes more closely." And so Jane leaned forward and then followed Dr. Crane's instructions as he first tested her peripheral vision and then also her forward eyesight. And then afterwards, Dr. Crane informed Jane that she had a couple of small blind spots in her vision that he had just discovered that made him want to examine her retinas a bit more closely. Dr. Crane took a little vial of liquid out of his white coat pocket and then told Jane to look straight up. He was going to dilate her retinas, the light-sensitive tissue at the back of the eye that transmits what we see to the brain. The doctor would first pour a little of that liquid into her eyes, and then he would use a device called an ophthalmoscope to shine some light on her retinas and get a better look at what was going on. And so as the liquid made her eyes become more sensitive, the light from the ophthalmoscope stung a bit, but Jane did her best to stay still as Dr. Crane looked at her retinas. And then finally, Dr. Crane switched off the ophthalmoscope and he smiled. He would order a CT scan to confirm his theory, but he was pretty sure he knew exactly what was going on. And 2 hours later, the CT scan confirmed Dr. Crane's suspicion. He told Jane that he'd seen some tiny yellow tissue deposits behind her retinas. These are a sign that her retinas are deteriorating, a condition called macular degeneration. It happens to lots of people as they age. Their eyesight gets worse, and because of that, the brain gets less visual information from their eyes. Now, most people with macular degeneration end up with nothing more serious than slightly blurrier eyesight. But in about 10% of cases, the brain tries to compensate for the lack of information by making up new visuals. For reasons that are still not clear, many of these people who are in this 10% see floating faces. It's very rare, but the symptoms are so consistent amongst patients who suffer from it that Dr. Crane immediately understood what Jane's problem was the moment he saw her drawing that football-shaped head doodle. 3 months after her diagnosis, Jane was unfortunately still having hallucinations, but they were growing more infrequent. Dr. Crane told Jane that while there was no treatment, the hallucinations can stop over time as the brain becomes more accustomed to vision loss. And at the very least, Jane could rest assured knowing that she was not possessed by a demonic entity, and she wasn't losing her mind either. She just had a very creative brain.
I'm Alice Levine.
And I'm Matt Ford, and we're the hosts of British Scandal.
Yes, indeed. In this series, a Derbyshire couple are bored of their curtain-twitching, lawn-mowing suburban life.
So they sell their house, build a yacht, and sail off around the world.
Which sort of sounds idyllic until a sperm whale sinks their boat and they begin to starve.
Oh yes, and they didn't bring a radio because real sailors don't use radios.
Right?
This is the story of Mrballen and Maurice Bailey.
And the 117 days they spent lost at sea.
Follow British Scandal wherever you get your podcasts or listen early and ad-free on Audible.
In 2021, a man is arrested in a Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be Irish orphan Arthur Knight.
I'm not Nicholas Rosie.
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley, for I Am Not Nicholas, the full story, and find out what happened next in Series 2, I Am Not Nicholas, The Trials. Across 3 brand new episodes, I'll take you inside the trials of Nicholas Rossi. We'll meet the women and detectives trying to bring him down, and the jurors who'll decide his fate. I even find myself being called to the witness stand.
I'm just concerned that I might come out with evidence that's not admissible. And if I do that, the trial collapses, all because of me.
That's I Am Not Nicholas, Series 1 and Series 2. You can binge all episodes early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts. In 2021, a man is arrested in a Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be an Irish orphan, Arthur Knight.
I'm not Nicholas Rosie.
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley for I Am Not Nicholas. You can binge all episodes of Series 1 and 2 early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts.
I'm Alice Levine.
And I'm Matt Ford, and we're the hosts of British Scandal.
Yes, indeed. In this series, a Derbyshire couple are bored of their curtain-twitching, lawn-mowing suburban life,
So they sell their house, build a yacht, and sail off around the world.
which sort of sounds idyllic until a sperm whale sinks their boat and they begin to starve.
Oh yes, and they didn't bring a radio because real sailors don't use radios.
Right?
This is the story of Mrballen and Maurice Bailey.
And the 117 days they spent lost at sea.
Follow British Scandal wherever you get your podcasts or listen early and ad-free on Audible.
Here is our second story called The Perfect Condition. On May 19th, 2010, 75-year-old Ron Sweden was at home in Brewster, Massachusetts, relaxing in his favorite armchair and flipping through TV channels in search of something good to watch. He'd finally settled on a game show when his wife Nancy called him for dinner. He sighed and turned off the TV, muttering about how he'd just gotten comfortable. He hobbled out of his chair and adjusted the plastic tube that he wore under his nose to help him breathe. The year before, Ron had been diagnosed with emphysema, a lung disease that causes shortness of breath. Emphysema is common in smokers, and Ron had been a smoker his whole life. Now, as a result, he needed an oxygen tank just to breathe properly. Ron sat down at the dining room table just as Nancy set a plate of scallops in front of him. Ron caught a whiff of melted butter, but his stomach didn't rumble with hunger the way it usually did when he smelled Nancy's amazing cooking. In fact, he didn't have an appetite at all, which was a shame because Nancy's scallops were his favorite meal. But Ron didn't want to be rude, so he thanked Nancy for dinner and tried to eat as best as he could, but he really just couldn't and just kind of pushed the food around his plate. And then when Nancy was done eating, Ron quickly got up and helped her clear the table and clean up before Ron settled back down to watch more TV. 2 weeks later, in early June, Ron was back in his favorite armchair in the living room, working on the daily crossword puzzle. He wasn't feeling his best, because he really had not eaten much since that scallop dinner a couple weeks ago. Now, Ron didn't think too much of it. He was getting older, and so he thought maybe he just didn't need as much food. Ron reread a clue on his crossword puzzle that had been stumping him all morning. He started to call out for Nancy, hoping she could help him, when a small tickle rose in his chest. He cleared his throat, and then all of a sudden he began coughing and hacking, and he couldn't stop. His chest felt stiff, like there was a wall of mucus that just was not breaking up. As he leaned back in his armchair, coughing so hard it was getting hard to even breathe. He heard footsteps behind him, and a minute later, Nancy was by his side with a glass of water. Ron tried to sip some down, but another cough hit him, and he spit the water everywhere. By the time this coughing fit passed, Ron's throat was so sore. He'd never experienced a cough like that, and it really scared him. He worried his emphysema was getting worse. Later that night, Ron was in his bedroom putting on pajamas when his back suddenly went stiff, almost like a spasm. He straightened up and kind of yelped in pain, and then threw his head back as another coughing fit overtook him. He hacked and coughed until he was shaking, and then Nancy came into the bedroom and rubbed his back until finally Ron began to recover. Once he had, Nancy asked him if he wanted to call the doctor, but he told her no. Clearly, his emphysema was just getting worse, and he would just have to deal with it. After decades and decades of smoking cigarettes, he knew his lungs just were not what they used to be. A few days later, Nancy was moving all through the house, vacuuming and cleaning up, trying to prep the house for Ron's sister and brother-in-law who were coming over to visit. The couple had just gotten back from Scotland on a vacation, and they were coming over to talk about the trip and catch up. Secretly, Nancy hoped they'd brought home some Scottish shortbread to share. Just before 5 p.m., the doorbell rang, and so Nancy called out to Ron, who was asleep in his armchair when she last saw him. Then Nancy threw open the front door and embraced her in-laws. She was always happy to see them, but especially right now. She wanted to be around family. Over the past few days, Ron's coughing fits had become so severe and so frequent, it was kind of scary. It was common for Ron to be doubled over and hacking up a lung 15 or 16 times a day. And so Nancy was genuinely worried about Ron's health, and so just liked the idea of having some family around, maybe take her mind off of that for a second. Nancy's brother-in-law handed her a brown bag that smelled like butter and seafood. Nancy opened it as she led the way inside, and the bag was full of her favorite lobster rolls. Not from Scotland, but just from down the street. However, still, it was a welcome treat. Nancy led everyone into the living room, where Ron was still fast asleep. Nancy shook his leg and told him his sister was here, but Ron didn't move. Nancy frowned, but she could see Ron's chest was rising and falling, so he seemed okay. And so she told her in-laws it might be best not to wake him. His coughing fits had been really bad lately and clearly had been tiring him out. Nancy moved into the kitchen to grab plates for the lobster rolls. She could hear her in-laws taking seats in the dining room. And just then, Nancy heard a familiar, horrible cough erupt in the living room. Nancy felt terrible for Ron as she listened to him hacking. She knew it was also very painful for him. His throat had been raspy and hoarse for the last 2 weeks because of these coughing fits. Then, Ron started gasping between his horrible coughs, like he couldn't even breathe. And then Nancy heard him groaning a little as though he was calling out for help. And so Nancy rushed into the living room. Ron was rocking in his chair, fighting for air between these violent coughs. His entire body was shaking, and Nancy thought he might be having a seizure. Panicked, she dialed 911. For the next few minutes, Nancy and her in-laws tried to soothe Ron until the EMTs finally arrived. By the time they had Ron on a stretcher and were rolling him into the ambulance, one of the EMTs told Nancy that she'd been right to call. Ron's blood pressure and oxygen saturation levels were dangerously low. If she hadn't called, Ron would likely be facing organ failure. And so as the EMT helped Nancy up into the ambulance, she felt terrified. Now Nancy was the one who was shaking as the ambulance door closed and they whisked their way towards Cape Cod Hospital. The next morning, the pulmonary and critical care specialist at Cape Cod Hospital, Dr. Scott Slater, made his way to Ron's hospital room. When Ron was brought into the emergency room the previous night, he had been quickly diagnosed with pneumonia, a lung infection that creates a buildup of fluid in the air sacs. For someone of Ron's age, pneumonia can be a very dangerous and even deadly condition. Now, the ER doctor had immediately given Ron antibiotics to help him fight off the infection, but so far Ron was not getting better. So, just an hour ago, Dr. Slater had ordered a chest x-ray, and now, because of that x-ray, he had a better idea of what was going on inside of Ron's lungs. Dr. Slater knocked on the doorway and walked into Ron's room. Ron was lying in bed, hooked up to an IV and an oxygen tank. Ron looked pale and tired, and his breathing was labored. Nancy was sitting in a chair beside him, and she looked up from the newspaper she'd been reading and gave Dr. Slater a weak smile. Dr. Slater gave her a sad look and then delivered the bad news. Ron's x-ray had revealed that he had a collapsed lung, which was likely causing his pneumonia. Dr. Slater guessed that the lung had collapsed because something was blocking an airway. He needed to get a closer look by performing a bronchoscopy, which meant sliding a little camera down Ron's throat and into his lungs. After giving Ron an injection of local anesthesia, which would mean Ron was awake but unable to feel pain, Dr. Slater slid the camera down Ron's esophagus. And immediately, the problem became clear. There was an abnormal-looking mass at the top of Ron's left bronchial tube. Dr. Slater couldn't tell what this mass was, so he took a little tissue sample of this mass to send to the labs for analysis. After he'd pulled the camera out of Ron's throat, Dr. Slater explained to Ron and to Nancy that he had found this mass inside of Ron's lungs. Now, it would be a few days before they'd know for sure what it was, but the doctor felt they should know right now that that mass could be cancer. As Dr. Slater left the hospital room, Ron felt terrified. But Nancy, she shook her head and told Ron there was no point in panicking until they knew the biopsy results. And then she kissed Ron on the forehead and told him she was going to step into the hallway and call their kids and his sister and let them know what was going on. Ron watched his wife leave, feeling his chest tighten, but not because another coughing fit was coming on. He was thinking about how much time he'd have left if the biopsy came back positive for lung cancer. It could be a matter of months, or maybe even less. The thought of leaving his family now brought on this horrible wave of fear. He could feel tears welling up in his eyes as he looked out into the hallway and watched Nancy pace as she called their loved ones to break the terrible news. 4 days later, Ron was still in the hospital, sitting up in bed, a tray of hospital food in front of him. He still wasn't hungry, so he just drank the juice out of the little plastic fruit cup they'd given him. Meanwhile, Nancy, who had barely left his bedside, was doing her best to try to coax her husband into taking a few bites. But just then, Ron heard a knock and looked up to see Dr. Slater standing in the doorway. Instinctively, Ron knew Dr. Slater had the biopsy results, and so Ron braced himself for the worst. But then, a smile crept across Dr. Slater's face. He told Ron and Nancy that there were absolutely signs of infection in the tissue, but no cancer cells. Ron was so relieved he almost started crying. He rubbed his eyes and felt Nancy's hand squeezing his shoulder. Ron breathed in as deeply as he could, trying to steady himself.
he didn't have cancer, but there was still a mass in his lung, and Ron thought that couldn't be normal. And so he asked Dr. Slater, since this mass was not a cancerous tumor, well, what is it? Dr. Slater admitted to Ron that he didn't know, but he hoped that a second biopsy would help him find out. 10 days later, Dr. Slater sat in the office of a colleague, Dr. Jeff Spillane. Dr. Spillane was a thoracic surgeon who specialized in the organs and tissue inside the chest. Dr. Slater had always considered him a good friend, and now Dr. Slater hoped that Dr. Spillane could be a good consultant, too. Dr. Slater was feeling frustrated with Ron's case and really needed a second opinion. Dr. Slater explained to Dr. Spillane that Ron's pneumonia had persisted and his cough had gotten worse over the past week and a half. It was almost like Ron's body was trying to cough up the mass on its own. But after 2 biopsies, Dr. Slater still didn't have any idea what this mass was. It looked like a tumor, but it was not cancerous, so it wasn't clear why it was making Ron so sick. Dr. Slater bounced his knees impatiently as Dr. Spillane read through Ron's file. Finally, Dr. Spillane suggested that they do a 3rd bronchoscopy, but this time they would put Ron under general anesthesia. If Ron was totally unconscious, they could do a more in-depth examination of Ron's chest. Dr. Slater was skeptical, but at this point, he was willing to try anything. So he agreed to let Dr. Spillane perform this procedure. Around 2 p.m. that afternoon, Dr. Slater was sitting in his office when he got a call from his friend Dr. Spillane. He just finished Ron's bronchoscopy, and now he said he had only one question for Dr. Slater. Did he have any dirt? For a moment, Dr. Slater was sure he'd misheard Dr. Spillane, until Dr. Spillane repeated himself and said that Dr. Slater was going to need some dirt for the thing he just found inside of Ron's lung. A sprouting pea plant, as in a living vegetable. Dr. Slater couldn't believe it. Ron must have eaten a raw pea that quite literally went down the wrong tube. Instead of landing in his stomach, it got into his lung. And there, the moist and warm conditions inside the lung were just right for the little pea to sprout. According to Dr. Spillane, the pea sprout was about half an inch long. It had clearly been in Ron's lung for a while because it was so coated in mucus that it looked like a little tumor. Dr. Spillane had easily removed the pea and surrounding mass, and Ron immediately began feeling better. Within a few days, he was coughing far less frequently, and his pneumonia disappeared. Ron still had emphysema, but it was far more manageable without the hacking cough. His appetite returned as well. In fact, his first meal when he left the hospital included a side of peas.
In the winter of 2023, a 28-year-old woman stepped away from her desk in Aberdeen, Scotland, to answer a call from her doctor's office. She'd recently gone in for testing because she'd been experiencing blurred vision and dizzy spells. She knew something was deeply wrong with her. Over the past few months, she'd been dealing with a barrage of health issues. So far, they'd all been external, like dry eyes and patches of raw sensitive skin. But now, it seemed like whatever was causing her symptoms was progressing, impairing her balance and vision now as well. When she got on the phone with her doctor, he told her that her blood work showed she had inflammation, as if her body were fighting off some kind of infection. However, the cause was unclear, because inflammation can be caused by a lot of things, including an injury or even stress. She went quiet for a moment, and then she told the doctor that she had a guess, but it was going to sound crazy. She was almost certain that her body was having an allergic reaction to her teeth. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, the next time the follow button's out of town, sneak into their house and unplug their refrigerator and leave the door open. Most of the time, milestones in life are something to celebrate. Birthday, a promotion, an anniversary, a wedding. But for the people in today's stories, what should have been something to celebrate quickly became a tragedy. In our first story, a woman becomes mysteriously sick after a friend's wedding with no solution in sight. And in our second story, a teenager about to start a memorable year of high school suddenly finds himself at death's door. Here is our first story called Rough Patch. On a Saturday afternoon in mid-September 2022, 28-year-old Lily Lindsay flopped down onto her hotel bed in Dubai, feeling ready for a nap. She and her boyfriend Brian had spent the morning at an extravagant brunch buffet at a nearby hotel. They were visiting Dubai from their home in Scotland and had been looking forward to the hotel brunch all week. It was an endless array of food, craft cocktails, and live cooking stations. By the time she and Brian had left, they were full and totally exhausted. Lily yawned and took out her phone and began absent-mindedly scrolling through her pictures from the past few days. She couldn't help but smile as she flipped through all the photos. Lily was not a vain person, but she had to admit she looked good. In the lead-up to their vacation, Lily had been eating well and exercising. Then, in August, she'd gotten some dental work done to correct her asymmetrical smile. Like most kids, Lily's adult teeth came in a bit crooked. She got in braces when she was a teenager, but the dentist had overcorrected, and as a result, her front teeth had always been a bit off-center. Lily had been a bit self-conscious about it, but never enough to get major dental work done. However, a few months ago, one of her friends had fixed their uneven teeth with veneers that went right over the front of each tooth like a shell. Most veneers are made from porcelain, but these were a new kind made from the same material the dentist used for cavity fillings, which made them about 10 times cheaper, and they looked just as good. And so, after doing some research, Lily began to save up for the veneers herself, and she premiered her new teeth a few weeks before this vacation at her best friend's engagement party. She had received a ton of compliments and had never felt more confident in her smile. Now, flipping through her pictures in their Dubai hotel room, it was clear that the money and effort had all been worth it. Lily got up and went to the bathroom to wash her face. Even though they'd only been in Dubai for a week, she already had a hint of a suntan. Her skin was glowing, except for 2 small red patches just beneath her eyes. They had appeared a couple days before she and Brian had left on their trip, but they weren't itchy or sensitive, so she decided not to worry about them. She figured it was most likely just a weird breakout that would clear up on its own. A month later, in October of 2022, Lily was back home in Scotland, rummaging through her bedroom closet. She pulled out some arts and crafts supplies, the at-home gel manicure set she'd used during COVID, and then finally found what she was looking for: a black bedsheet. She wrapped it around herself, then pulled a silver mask over her face. Then she took a look in the bedroom mirror. It wasn't the best Halloween costume she'd ever put together, but it would have to do. Lily had planned to be a desperate housewife like the rest of her friends going to the party. But she had decided to invent a costume instead. She wanted to wear something that would hide her face, because now it was completely covered in painful red rashes. After she came home from Dubai, those 2 patches beneath her eyes had not gone away on their own. Instead, they began to get worse and swell. And then the skin around her eyes also got red and very wrinkly looking. In the mornings, the skin on her face felt so tight and swollen that it was painful to open her eyes. And then once she started blinking and moving around, her eyes would itch and water. She had to rub at them all the time, which only further irritated the skin, and on top of that, her lips were super dry and cracked. At first, she thought all of this was just some sort of allergic reaction, like hay fever, and went to see a doctor. But he said she most likely had perioral dermatitis, a form of rosacea that can cause a red, sometimes scaly rash around the mouth, nose, and eyes. The doctor prescribed a low dose of hydrocortisone cream and a rosacea cream to help with the swelling. He also told her to stay away from a common ingredient in cosmetics and cleaning supplies called sodium lauryl sulfate, which can make the rosacea worse. Finally, he told her to try over-the-counter antihistamines to help with her itchy, watery eyes. Following this appointment, at first, Lily's eyes cleared up, and within a week, her skin was back to normal. But then, the red patches came back with a vengeance and spread over her entire face. She had no idea what was causing the breakout, but she told the doctor that the first rashes had appeared right after she had gotten her new teeth at the end of the summer. It was also around the time that she had changed her diet and exercise routine for Dubai, and so she wondered if one of those things had triggered the rashes. But her doctor assured her that veneers and healthy foods and exercise wouldn't have caused this skin condition. But until they figured out the real culprit, Lily knew she'd be attending costume parties as a makeshift silver-faced ghost. 6 weeks later, on an evening in December, Lily sat in a restaurant with friends, feeling stressed. She scanned the menu, searching for a food item she could actually eat. Since that Halloween party, her rashes had spread even further. Now her entire body was covered in red patches that were so inflamed it hurt to shower. And some days, the flare-ups under her arms were so painful she could barely put her arms down. Lily's doctor still didn't know what was causing her condition. He wanted to test her for scary diseases like lupus, a chronic disease that can seriously damage many parts of the body. However, before she took that step, Lily went to see a dermatologist, and they actually diagnosed her with eczema. This diagnosis made sense. Lily had eczema as a toddler, and the dermatologist told her that it could come back later in life, and usually when it did, it was much worse than before. And so the dermatologist prescribed her moisturizers to clear up the rashes. However, the creams only made the rashes worse. Lily tried every moisturizer on the market, and none of them seemed to help. And so the dermatologist suggested they do an allergy test, thinking that maybe Lily was exposing herself to some chemical that was causing her skin to break out. However, this test presented a problem. They couldn't test Lily's skin while it was inflamed because the rashes would cause false positives. So they had to get her skin cleared up for a full 2 months before administering the allergy test. That meant a big lifestyle change for Lily. First, she had to use a steroid cream to clear her skin, which was something she was kind of nervous about using. It was slowly working, but Lily didn't like using the cream all the time because steroids have downsides. In this case, this type of cream can cause rosacea, skin thinning, and even fungal infections. Plus, if she took even 1 day off from the steroid cream, her rashes would come back within hours, and they would sting so badly she'd want to claw her skin off. So, Lily also spent a month doing elimination diets, cutting out different foods that were known to make eczema flare up. For the past few weeks, she'd been eliminating dairy products, which made it difficult to enjoy a night out with friends. Almost everything at restaurants is cooked in butter, which is dairy. And so when the server came to the table, Lily glumly ordered a salad. These days, Lily was in pain all the time, which made it hard for her to leave the house. But she still had to get up and go to work most days. Her managers did not understand the seriousness of her condition and wouldn't let her work from home, even when she had a flare-up. And on top of everything else, her best friend was getting married in June, and Lily was the maid of honor. She had to plan a bridal shower and a bachelorette party in Spain, but she felt too distracted by her skin condition to focus on the wedding. She couldn't help but feel like she was letting everybody down. And so Lily decided to make another doctor's appointment, but this time it was with a mental health professional. Years ago, she'd taken a low dose of antidepressants to help her cope with anxiety. She decided it was time to go back on them, at least until she felt like herself again. 2 months later, in early February of 2023, Lily sat on an examination table while her dermatologist taped more than 200 small round patches to her back. These were allergy test strips, and each of the little bubbles contained a different allergen. Lily just hoped that one of them was the cause of her eczema. But if she was being honest with herself, Lily was feeling a bit disappointed. She'd asked the dermatologist to test whether she was allergic to a key ingredient in her veneers called acrylic, but he had said no. Lily's first doctor had assured her that acrylic veneers would not have caused her skin condition, but some part of her still wondered if they were to blame, since the rash began right after she got her veneers. She pointed this out to her new dermatologist, but he said the same thing. An allergy to the filling material in her veneers, which is acrylic-based, was basically impossible. People do develop allergies to acrylics, but only through repeated exposure to acrylic chemicals. Lily didn't live or work in that kind of environment, so an acrylic allergy test would basically be a waste of time. By the time her dermatologist was done, Lily's back looked like it had been bubble wrapped, and the strips on her back were already beginning to itch. She had more than 200 chemical samples on her skin. She was bound to be allergic to at least a few of them. The dermatologist reminded Lily that she had to leave these patches on all weekend. She nodded, already dreading the discomfort she knew the next few days would bring. But she told herself that if she could just push through to Monday, she'd have an answer. She would know what was causing her eczema, and maybe this nightmare would finally be over. The following Wednesday, Lily walked into her dermatologist's office for the third time in less than a week. She'd gotten the allergy patches removed on Monday morning, after suffering through the most miserable weekend of her life. The entire patch test had irritated her skin, and several of the patches actually burned. Plus, she hadn't been allowed to shower with the patches on her back, which made her feel grimy and even more uncomfortable. The only thing that made the weekend bearable was her boyfriend Brian, who had come home with an ice cream maker to help distract Lily from the pain. They'd spent Saturday making peach sorbet and binging Real Housewives. And so now, her dermatologist would hopefully know what was causing her excruciating eczema. The doctor told Lily to hop onto the examination table so he could take a look at her back. Since Monday, most of the irritation had cleared up, leaving only a couple of sore spots. Those were the positive allergens, and then told Lily he had good news. He'd identified about 10 allergens for her to avoid. Lily was thrilled until he handed her the list of allergens. It included lavender oil and a handful of other chemicals commonly used in cosmetic creams and serums. But Lily never used lavender oil, and it had been months since she put any kind of cream or serum on her skin. There was no way her eczema was being triggered by any of these chemicals. She realized the allergy test had basically been a painful waste of time. Lily was furious as she drove home. Her eczema was still out of control, and none of the creams she'd been prescribed were working. The elimination diet had done nothing to help. The steroid cream was only a short-term solution, and if she didn't figure out what was causing her eczema soon, she was going to be patchy and in pain for her best friend's bachelorette party and wedding. Lily felt like she knew something happened last August to trigger this eczema. There was no other explanation. But every doctor she talked to had told her that her veneer theory was wrong. It was maddening. However, Lily was ready to trust her gut on this and take matters into her own hands. In late April 2023, Dr. Camilla Campbell felt worried as she walked into her next appointment. 8 months ago, she'd given her patient, Lily, a beautiful set of veneers. And now, Lily was insisting on having them removed. Several weeks earlier, Lily came in for a consultation, absolutely convinced that she was allergic to her new teeth. She said her mom had watched a morning talk show segment about people who developed an allergy to acrylics after using at-home gel nail kits. Lily realized she had used those exact nail kits repeatedly during the COVID pandemic, and so she was now certain that that had made her allergic to her acrylic-based teeth. Dr. Campbell had tried her best to talk Lily out of this procedure of having her veneers removed. The doctor had consulted multiple other dentists around Scotland, and all of them agreed with her. There was no way Lily's teeth were causing such extreme eczema, but Lily had been insistent. The teeth were coming off. Dr. Campbell walked into the room and greeted Lily, who was already waiting in her dentist chair. She told Lily they'd be using a gum shield for the procedure. On the off chance Lily really was severely allergic to the veneers, Dr. Campbell worried that when she began grinding them off of her, the dust from her teeth could send her into anaphylactic shock. Dr. Campbell asked Lily one more time if she really wanted to go through with this, but Lily nodded her head. She was resolved. So Dr. Campbell fired up her drill. A few weeks later, Lily and the other bachelorettes reached the departure gate for their flight to Spain. Her best friend told everyone to gather around for a photo. Lily leaned in and smiled brightly, because for the first time in nearly a year, her face was completely clear. All this time, Lily had been right. She was allergic to her veneers. During COVID quarantine, she had passed the time doing her nails with an at-home gel manicure kit that contained acrylic, just like her veneers. She had bought a cheaper kit just to save money, not realizing that there were some chemicals in the gel nail polish that could be harmful. And over time, repeated exposure to those chemicals gave her an allergy to acrylics. They caused a massive allergic reaction. However, once the veneers were removed, the eczema almost entirely cleared up. Lily still has to be careful with her skin, because while eczema is no longer affecting her face, she still struggles with occasional red patches on her body. Plus, her skin is more sensitive. For her best friend's wedding, she decided not to get a facial or spray tan with the rest of the bachelorettes. She didn't want to chance a flare-up before the wedding. She doesn't know why her eczema has not gone away entirely, but she's working with a new doctor to try and figure that out. Lily shared her story with People magazine in the hopes of spreading awareness about acrylic allergies. While these allergies are certainly rare, they can be damaging and painful to treat. She believes that dental offices should test for these allergies before using them on a patient. But most importantly, Lily is relieved to feel like herself again, and she hopes her skin will stay clear for another upcoming wedding. She and Brian got engaged in January of 2024 and hope to get married towards the end of 2025.
I'm Alice Levine.
And I'm Matt Ford, and we're the hosts of British Scandal.
Yes, indeed. In this series, a Derbyshire couple are bored of their curtain-twitching, lawn-mowing suburban life.
So they sell their house, build a yacht, and sail off around the world.
Which sort of sounds idyllic until a sperm whale sinks their boat and they begin to starve.
Oh yes, and they didn't bring a radio because real sailors don't use radios.
Right?
This is the story of Mrballen and Maurice Bailey.
And the 117 days they spent lost at sea.
Follow British Scandal wherever you get your podcasts or listen early and ad-free on Audible.
I'm Alice Levine.
And I'm Matt Ford, and we're the hosts of British Scandal.
Yes, indeed. In this series, a Derbyshire couple are bored of their curtain-twitching, lawn-mowing suburban life,
So they sell their house, build a yacht, and sail off around the world.
which sort of sounds idyllic until a sperm whale sinks their boat and they begin to starve.
Oh yes, and they didn't bring a radio because real sailors don't use radios.
Right?
This is the story of Mrballen and Maurice Bailey.
And the 117 days they spent lost at sea.
Follow British Scandal wherever you get your podcasts or listen early and ad-free on Audible.
In 2021, a man is arrested in a Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be an Irish orphan, Arthur Knight.
I'm not Nicholas Rosie.
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley, for I Am Not Nicholas. You can binge all episodes of Series 1 and 2 early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts. In 2021, a man is arrested in a Glasgow COVID ward. Police say he is fugitive Nicholas Rossi. He claims to be Irish orphan Arthur Knight.
I'm not Nicholas Rosie.
But that was only the beginning. Join me, Jane McSorley, for I Am Not Nicholas, the full story, and find out what happened next in Series 2, I Am Not Nicholas, The Trials. Across 3 brand new episodes, I'll take you inside the trials of Nicholas Rossi. We'll meet the women and detectives trying to bring him down, and the jurors who'll decide his fate. I even find myself being called to the witness stand.
I'm just concerned that I might come out with evidence that's not admissible. And if I do that, the trial collapses, all because of me.
That's I Am Not Nicholas, Series 1 and Series 2. You can binge all episodes early and ad-free by joining Audible on the Audible app or Apple Podcasts.
Here is our second and final story called No Warning. On the morning of August 15th, 2020, 16-year-old Rohan Godhania stood in his kitchen mixing up a protein shake. He was trying to put on some muscle before school started in a few weeks. Rohan took a sip and grimaced. The shake was thick and chalky, which he just was not expecting because he did not often drink protein shakes. But Rohan was never one to back down from a challenge, so he adjusted his glasses and steeled himself, then gulped the whole shake down. When he was done, he slammed the glass down on the counter in triumph. He told himself he was going to learn to like those shakes because he was going to get jacked. Rohan put the dirty glass in the dishwasher, then bounded up the stairs to his bedroom on the second floor, already feeling stronger. In truth, he was a very skinny kid, especially for his age. And even though Rohan knew he had a lot going for him, good grades, a bright future, a very winning personality, he really wanted big muscles, or at least to weigh more than a 12-year-old. Rohan opened the door to his bedroom and made a beeline for his piano keyboard. Rohan was a very accomplished musician and loved practicing just about every day. But this morning, he stopped himself and instead turned toward the Nintendo Wii game system hooked up to the television on top of his dresser. He grabbed the Wii remote and began browsing through Wii Fit games until he came to strength training. Rohan thought that if he started right now and kept on sucking down those protein shakes, maybe he really could build some actual muscle by the time classes resumed. At lunchtime, Rohan's father, Hitendra, made sandwiches for the two of them and then called Rohan to the kitchen table. But while Hitendra wolfed his meal down in about 4 bites, he noticed that his son barely touched his food. Rohan told him his stomach hurt, and Hitendra just nodded, understanding. He told his son it was fine if he didn't want to finish his lunch, and encouraged Rohan to go lie down and take a nap. Hopefully that would settle his stomach. Rohan smiled at his father and then left the kitchen. Once the boy was gone, Hitendra picked up Rohan's plate and began to tidy up. But then he heard the distinct sound of dry heaving coming from the upstairs bathroom. Hitendra dropped the plates into the sink and hurried upstairs to check on Rohan, who he found kneeling over the toilet. Rohan retched repeatedly as his father rubbed his back reassuringly. Then Hitendra suggested Rohan stay in bed for the rest of the day. It seemed like he must have picked up some kind of stomach bug. Once Rohan was in his bed with a waste can nearby just in case, Hitendra went back downstairs and found the protein powder he'd gotten for Rohan. It was the only unusual thing Rohan had eaten over the past couple of days, and Hitendra wondered if it had gone bad or had some strange ingredients in it. Hitendra scanned the label, and he saw the expiration date was not for a while, and none of the ingredients stood out to him as unusual or alarming, so he shrugged and put the protein powder back where it went in the cupboard, convinced his son would feel better by morning.
But when Hitendra went to check on Rohan the next morning, the boy was as white as a sheet. Rohan admitted he'd vomited a few times overnight and that he felt even worse than the day before. The boy propped himself up in bed, squinting. Hitendra thought his son might be looking for his glasses, so Hitendra told Rohan they were on the nightstand. Rohan nodded slowly, but then he started looking around the room as if he didn't know where to find his own nightstand. Hitendra frowned and just pointed at the nightstand, and Rohan's face suddenly lit up as though he was pleasantly surprised to even find a table there. Now, Hitendra couldn't help but feel more concern for his son. He wondered if Rohan was so dehydrated that he was confused. So he helped Rohan downstairs and sat him at the kitchen table while he went to grab a bottle of the sports drink they always kept in the pantry. But when Hitendra returned to the kitchen carrying his son's drink, his son suddenly seemed even stranger. Rohan glared at his father with utter contempt. When Hitendra asked if everything was okay, Rohan snapped that his father should mind his own business. Then Rohan got up so aggressively that the table shook. Then Rohan just stood there staring icily at his father. This was very unlike Rohan, and so Hitendra knew something had to be deeply wrong. Rohan was so gentle normally, but now he was erratic and aggressive and confused. Hitendra knew his son needed to see a doctor, but something told him it was just not safe to try to take Rohan to the hospital by himself right now, like not in this state. Something was terribly wrong. So to play it very safe, Hitendra just called an ambulance. A few hours later, Rohan's mother, Pushpa, arrived at West Middlesex Hospital, where the paramedics had taken her son. She kept telling herself that Rohan would be just fine, but Pushpa still felt incredibly anxious as she entered the hospital lobby. Her husband, Hitendra, met her in the hallway outside of Rohan's room and explained that Rohan had become increasingly agitated on his way to the hospital, and he kept trying to get up and move around the ambulance on the way, and Hitendra actually had to physically restrain him on the stretcher to keep him from jumping out the back doors. Pushpa just blinked in surprise at this incredibly strange turn of events. Rohan was just not the type of boy to fly into a rage, let alone leap out of a moving vehicle, and so fear began creeping into Pushpa's mind, much the way it had already creeped into Hitendra's mind. And so Pushpa followed Hitendra into Rohan's hospital room, hoping to find Rohan back to himself and feeling better, but instead, Rohan was sitting up in bed, hunched over a kidney-shaped bowl and vomiting. Pushpa felt instant sympathy for her son as she watched him throw up, but that wasn't the worst of it. There were tubes hooked up to Rohan's arms, and wires patched to his chest, leading to all sorts of whirring and beeping machines. Whatever was wrong with Rohan was clearly more serious than just the flu or some other minor ailment. Pushpa looked back at Hitendra, whose eyes were full of concern. Hitendra explained that Rohan had been deteriorating ever since they arrived at the hospital, and the doctors still had no idea what was making Rohan sick. Rohan was complaining of intense abdominal pain and kept forgetting where he was or how he'd even gotten there. Suddenly the knot in Pushpa's chest tightened and her breathing quickened as she grappled with what Hitendra was saying, and so kind of panicking, she just stepped out into the hallway and let out a scream of absolute despair. Her son was falling apart before her eyes, and there wasn't anything she could do. She felt so hopeless. Pushpa bent over and braced her hands on her knees, sucking in long breaths of air. When she finally felt like she had collected herself, she went back into the hospital room and planted a kiss on Rohan's forehead. She told her son everything was going to be fine, even though inside she didn't know that. Then she stood next to Hitendra, gripping his hand tightly. Over the next few hours, Pushpa and Hitendra paced the hospital room as their son alternated between moments of confusion and extreme agitation. All the while, doctors and nurses came in and out, explaining all the tests and treatments they were doing to try to figure out what was wrong. The doctors said that they suspected that Rohan was suffering from some kind of inflammation around the spinal column and brain, and so they started him on medication right away for the two most likely conditions, which were meningitis and encephalopathy. For a little while, Rohan did seem to get better with the medication. But just before midnight, he started to get restless and agitated again, and he began trying to jump out of the bed, which would have torn out all the wires and IV lines. And so Hitendra did his best to hold the teenager down, while Pushpa repeatedly pressed the call button for help. A moment later, two nurses were in Rohan's room, attaching restraints to Rohan's wrists so that he couldn't get out of bed. A doctor said that Rohan was getting too unstable to remain in a regular hospital room, and he directed the nurses to move him to the intensive care unit. Pushpa was shocked. She knew Rohan was sick, but she still couldn't believe his condition had gotten this bad, and so she had to fight to hold in another scream. The nurse said that Rohan would be sedated once he got upstairs, and he would likely be asleep for hours. She urged Pushpa and Hitendra to go home for the night and then come back rested in the morning. Pushpa hated the idea of leaving her son, but she also knew that he'd be under close watch in the ICU without them. And if Rohan was going to be in the hospital for a few days, she and Hitendra would need some sleep. So they followed the medical team to the ICU and they stayed with their son until he fell asleep, and then after kissing their boy goodnight, the parents headed home. When they got there, Pushpa threw on some pajamas and crawled into bed, but she felt like she was not going to be able to sleep. She just stared at the ceiling thinking of her son, and she would lay there, her thoughts racing, until about 5 a.m. when her phone started ringing. It was the hospital. The doctor explained that Rohan's condition had actually taken another serious turn for the worse over the night. Rohan was now struggling so hard to breathe that he had to be intubated and put on a ventilator, which meant that a machine was now keeping him alive. Absolutely shocked and terrified, Pushpa shook Hitendra awake, and then she ran to wake up their 17-year-old daughter, Alicia, and then the three of them threw on their shoes and raced to the hospital. By the time they arrived, Rohan's doctor was there to meet them. The doctor admitted that they were struggling to get Rohan stabilized, but he was not actually in immediate danger. Once he was stable, they planned to do another CT scan so they'd have a better picture of what was going on in his brain. Pushpa felt like she was going to faint, so she sank into one of the chairs that lined the pale blue hallway of the ICU. She was vaguely aware that Hitendra and Alicia had sat down on either side of her, and each had taken one of her hands. After the doctor left, Hitendra squeezed Pushpa's hand and reminded her that while all of this sounded terrifying, Rohan was in good hands here. Pushpa wanted to believe that, but the drumbeat of bad news over and over and over again was making it hard for her to be optimistic. Pushpa sat tensely by Rohan's bed for the entire day, willing her boy to get better. Rohan's doctor came to check in every few hours, assuring them that Rohan would get his CT scan once he was stable enough. And then finally, in the late afternoon, technicians were able to perform that CT scan of Rohan's brain. And then, around 6 p.m., Rohan's doctor slowly walked into his room, staring at the floor. The doctor took a deep breath and looked Pushpa in the eye. He told her that Rohan had severe swelling in his brain, which can be fatal if it's not controlled. The doctor said he had already called the neurosurgery department at nearby Charing Cross Hospital, but the team there had said they could not, in good conscience, operate on Rohan to relieve the pressure. Given the extent of his brain injury and meningitis, they were not confident he would survive the surgery. Pushpa struggled to understand what the doctor was even saying, that essentially her son was too far gone to help. She hadn't even considered this possibility. Her boy was only 16 years old. Despite all her worry over the past few days, she had fully believed her son would eventually get better. He had to. Pushpa told the doctor he had to be wrong, but the look on the man's face said everything. Her boy was beyond helping. The following evening, on August 18th, Pushpa sat on the edge of Rohan's bed, her hand wrapped around his. Rohan lay motionless, still intubated and hooked up to IVs and machines. Hitendra and Rohan's sister, Alicia, sat nervously on the other side of Rohan's bed. Rohan's doctor was leaning over him, essentially checking the teen for signs of life. He stood and slowly turned to Pushpa and her family. He looked truly sad as he said that Rohan showed no brain activity. Then he said he would give them time to say their goodbyes, and he left the room. Pushpa stroked her son's hand, still unable to accept what was happening. Alicia tucked a teddy bear under Rohan's arms. He'd had it since he was a baby, and still slept with it every night in the corner of his bed. The whole family knew he'd want his bear to be with him now. For the rest of the afternoon, the family sat in silence as they struggled to say goodbye to Rohan. And then finally, at 5:03 p.m., Rohan passed away, and Pushpa's heart shattered. But her family did not get much time to grieve, only a few minutes. A doctor entered the room and asked Pushpa and Hitendra to consider donating Rohan's organs. He apologized for how quickly they'd need to make this decision, but organs need to be harvested for transplant as soon after death as possible. The doctor knew it was small consolation, but he said that Rohan's death could very likely save other lives. The doctor then held out some lengthy forms. The idea of filling out paperwork in the same hour that her young son died was repulsive to Pushpa. But she understood, and she knew what decision Rohan would have made. And so she and Hitendra took the forms and agreed to donate Rohan's organs. A few weeks later, Pushpa sat in Rohan's bedroom back at their home outside of London, holding his teddy bear to her chest. It was the only one of his belongings that she'd touched since her son had died. The grief of losing a child was almost more than she could bear. And since his death, something else had really been eating at her. Pushpa still didn't even know what had made Rohan sick. And because they had donated his organs, there hadn't been time to conduct an autopsy. And so she was really struggling to accept that she'd just never learned what had killed him. Pushpa worried that if what had killed Rohan was something genetic or environmental, his sister Alicia might also be at risk. But more than anything, she wanted to know if something could have been done to save Rohan. It just felt like this huge question mark was looming over her family's head, occupying every waking thought. 13 months after Rohan's death, so in September of 2021, Hitendra ignored Pushpa's running commentary on his wild driving as he weaved in and out of traffic. They were on the way home from Alicia's university. They'd just finished moving her into the dorms for the fall semester, which felt even more bittersweet than Hitendra had anticipated. He and Pushpa were empty nesters now, but only because Rohan was gone. Hitendra did not want to go home and cook a dinner for just 2 people. He was about to bring up the possibility of maybe going out to a restaurant when Pushpa's phone rang. It was an unknown number, but for some reason, the hair on the back of Hitendra's neck pricked up, and he told Pushpa to please answer it. And so Pushpa did, and she connected her phone to the car speaker so they could both listen. The man on the other line sounded grim. He explained that he was from the National Health Service blood and transplant team, the people who harvested their son's organs for transplant. Hitendra exchanged a quick, surprised glance with Pushpa as this man went on. The man said they needed Pushpa and Hitendra to come into the office for an urgent meeting. Hitendra was confused, but offered to drive straight to the office. They could be there within the hour. The man said that would be great and thanked them. Hitendra felt more curious than alarmed, so he pushed the gas pedal a bit faster as Pushpa reset the GPS to their new destination. What Pushpa and Hitendra learned at this meeting absolutely shocked them. The National Health Service team member explained that the recipient of Rohan's liver had become gravely ill earlier that year. A biopsy on the liver that had come from Rohan revealed a very dangerous condition with a very complicated name. It's called ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency, or OTCD for short. OTCD is a genetic condition that prevents the body from breaking down ammonia, which can cause the toxic chemical to build up to lethal levels in the bloodstream. The man explained that the recipient of Rohan's liver didn't have OTCD before his transplant surgery, so the illness had to come from the donated liver, Rohan's liver. And so the team member told the parents that their son almost certainly suffered from OTCD. Finally, 13 months after Rohan had passed away, his parents knew what had actually killed him. Pushpa and Hitendra stared at each other in disbelief. They were relieved to get some answers, but they didn't know anything about OTCD and why it would have suddenly killed Rohan like that, and so they asked for more information. The NHS team member explained that some people with OTCD don't even know they have it because the disease is inactive. However, the illness can be triggered by a big dose of protein. And in Rohan's case, he had drank a huge protein shake on the morning he got sick. He'd never consumed so much protein before so quickly, and his body basically couldn't handle it, and so that's what prompted him to get sick. Pushpa and Hitendra were obviously devastated. If they'd only known about Rohan's kind of inactive condition, they would have never let him drink protein shakes like that. Now, could that have forever prevented him from getting the disease? They don't know. But certainly, that protein shake is what prompted it. Thankfully, though, it does not seem likely that their daughter has OTCD, which affects an estimated 1,000 people in the United Kingdom alone. More studies are being conducted on OTCD, but as far as we know, it is extremely dangerous, killing about 50% of infants diagnosed with it at birth, and around 10% of people diagnosed with it when they're 16 or older, which was Rohan's age. However, there were no warnings that the protein powder that Rohan ingested could trigger this terrible disease. Rohan's experience ultimately prompted calls for new warnings to be printed on all supermarket boxes.